Over the span of 3 decades, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Doris Kearns Goodwin has written about such political figures as Lyndon Johnson, the Kennedys, and Roosevelts. In Wait Till Next Year, Ms. Goodwin looks back on her childhood and her love of baseball and reading. Her latest book is Team of Rivals, about President Lincoln's leadership and his relationship with 3 powerful members of his cabinet. Next, a 3-hour discussion with author and historian Doris Kearns Goodwin.
Doris Kearns Goodwin, at last count, 1,191 books in print on Abraham Lincoln, more than John Kennedy, Franklin Roosevelt, and Ronald Reagan combined. Why this latest?
I knew I wanted to live with him, and I just had to have a leap of faith that I could find something that would be my own way into him. But they take me so long, these books. The last one on Eleanor and Franklin took 6 years longer than World War II. So I knew this was going to be a big part of my life. I wanted to know about him. I wanted to know about the Civil War. And he turned out to be the best companion I could have imagined.
How did you begin the process?
Well, at first, I just read. I was just reading and reading and reading. And I hoped at the beginning to do a book about Abe and Mary, the way I had done with Eleanor and Franklin. But I realized that she couldn't hold the public side of the story. Mary couldn't, the way Eleanor did. And as I started reading more and more, I realized that he was spending even more time with the members of his cabinet, Seward, Chase, and Stanton, than with Mary. He was almost married to them more. It's such a tense time. They wait for news from the battlefield. They go to the front. They relax together at night. So I thought, these are the guys I'm interested in. And then when it turned out they had been his rivals beforehand, I finally realized I've got my story.
Now, there's a book that came out more than 60 years ago by Burton Hendrick on Lincoln's war cabinet.
Exactly.
What's
so.
different from that book and this one?
Well, what he did was not so much primary sources. He used secondary sources, and there was a lot of good stuff in them. He's a very good writer. But he had one huge chapter on Chase, one huge chapter on Seward, one huge chapter on Stanton. Mine is really a narrative and goes back to intertwining them all from the beginning to the end.
You've written a number of books that included primary sources. You're now dealing with 19th century figures as opposed to 20th century figures. So how do you go about the research process?
Well, I was worried at first because I'd been so lucky. Even in the Roosevelt time, there were 36 people who knew him, who knew the family. And of course, with Lyndon Johnson, I was able to spend hours at a time talking with that giant of a man. So I thought, how am I going to go back to a period where I can't talk to anyone? But it turns out because they kept diaries and because they wrote letters in that period of time, it's an even more intimate source than anything we'll have today. Historians 200 years from now will never know as much about us, I think, as we're able to know about these characters in the 19th century. Even Seward's family, his Secretary of State, 5,000 letters they wrote between them. So I love reading letters from, you feel like you're right over their shoulders.
I want to read a couple of excerpts from the book. First of all, you say that Abraham Lincoln, William Henry Seward, Salmon Chase, and Edward Bates were members of a restless generation of Americans destined to leave behind the 18th century world of their fathers. Thousands of miles separate their birthplaces of Virginia, New York, New Hampshire, and Kentucky. Nonetheless, social and economic forces shaped their path and also marked a number of similarities. How so?
Well, I think what was so interesting for all the members of that generation, the American experiment in democracy was still new. So here's this next generation coming along. Politics is the passion of the people. So it's not surprising that all these characters entered political life. When they would give a talk or there'd be a debate, 10,000 people might come, and people would listen to 4-hour talks, not what you could imagine today. They say that politics back then was what sports are for us today. So that's what shaped all of them. They all wanted to become lawyers so that they could become politicians, so they could participate in the public life of our country, because that's where the passion was.
Why didn't one of these become a running mate to Abraham Lincoln?
That's a great question. I think partly because once they got there and the convention decided that it was Abraham Lincoln, then they're looking somehow for balance, and they probably knew that none of these guys would be willing to accept the vice presidency. Vice presidency wasn't very powerful in those days, so I can imagine they would rather say, no, we'll wait and we'll beat him the next time around.
Let's go through each individual. First of all, who was William Seward?
Seward's my favorite of the characters. He reminds me of Churchill. He could drink, he could smoke. He had parties in his house in the 1850s where there'd be so much wine that even Southerners would feel good about the Northerners. And he was the one who everybody thought would be the nominee. He had been the great anti-slavery orator in the 50s, the most celebrated name. So many people came to his house waiting for the news that he had been nominated. The champagne had already been uncorked. He was irrecoverably disappointed. And yet, when Lincoln appointed him Secretary of State, he thought he would control Lincoln, and Lincoln would be a mere figurehead. But in the end, he and Lincoln became great friends once he realized that Lincoln was who Lincoln was, a very special character. And their friendship was one of the most surprising parts of this for me.
Salmon Chase.
Now, Salmon Chase was a different kind of character than Seward because he didn't drink, he didn't smoke, very religious. He would practice jokes that he could never quite deliver with ease. He kept a diary from the time he was 20 years old, and he was a very self-righteous kind of character. However, he had been great as an abolitionist, so he was an honorable person in the problems for black equality. He wanted to be president so much that even when Lincoln made him Secretary of the Treasury, he still kept running against Lincoln and tried to maneuver against him and win the second time around, but Lincoln bested him.
And Judge Edward Bates.
Bates was an elder statesman from Missouri, and people thought maybe he could be president because he was more conservative and came from a border state. When he was a young man, he was very interested in politics like the rest of them, but then he got married to this woman that he loved so much that he couldn't bear being away from her. When he was on his way to Congress, he said, "Why am I doing this? I miss you. I have this indefinable, restless feeling." Well, he wasn't away from her very long because they had 17 children. But it's interesting. It shows how family life can affect public life. In the 19th century, when men wrote about history, they'd barely mention that you had a wife or a family. But you can see in each one of these cases, even Chase, he had this beautiful daughter. He lost 3 young wives at 22, 25, and 30 or something. And this daughter becomes his life and his campaign manager and his partner, marries a wealthy older man just to further his ambitions, and then she dies in poverty. So I love these stories of the wives and the husbands.
17 children. How many lived to adulthood?
9 lived to adulthood.
You write about the man in your life in the epilogue of the book, and you say that you dedicate this book to your husband. I owe more than I can ever express to my husband, Richard Goodwin, to whom this book is dedicated. He read and edited every single page. I argued with him. What did you argue about?
Well, sometimes we would argue about whether Lincoln was doing the right thing. He's such a huge Lincoln fan, and we would decide if I were trying to be critical of him, and he'd say, "What are you saying? That's my Lincoln." And I'd say, "No, this is wrong of him, this is right of him." It was fantastic. He's studied Lincoln all the time. We're both writers. We work at home, he in one section of the house, me in another section, and it was fantastic to have somebody like that reading every single, I'd give pages every day as I finished them.
And you go on, you say you debated about Lincoln, and he thought as deeply about Lincoln as anyone. Did he inspire you to do this book, or did you come up with the idea of Lincoln initially?
I think I came up with the idea of it, but once I got into it and he started reading about Lincoln as well, you know, my husband was a speechwriter for John Kennedy and for Lyndon Johnson, and so he understands the value of words in public life. So there's nobody that he felt more comfortable with than Lincoln's brilliance as a wordsmith and as a speaker to the nation.
Who came up with the title?
Oh, the title was a problem. For a while, we wanted to call it Master Among Men, because that's really what it's about, his human relationships. But given that he was the great emancipator, it seemed like that might be a worrisome word to use the title with the master in it. I always knew Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln would be the subtitle, but for a while we were going to call it The Great Unifier or American Colossus, and this had always been the working title way from the beginning. So we just went back to what it had been as the working title, Team of Rivals, which is really what it's about.
Our conversation for the next 3 hours here on C-SPAN 2's Book TV In Depth, Doris Kearns Goodwin. As always, we welcome your phone calls. If you live in the Eastern and Central time zones, the number to call is 202-737-0001. For those of you in the Mountain or Pacific time zones, 202-737-0002. And you can email us your questions at booktv@cspan.org. In your last conversation with Lyndon Johnson, you talked about Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, interestingly, he was reading Sandberg's biography on Lincoln and trying to conjure Lincoln to life, and he couldn't quite do it. And he said if he couldn't bring Lincoln to life in his mind, no one was going to remember him. He was so haunted in those last years by whether history would remember him. You know, I now realize more than I did when I was 25 years old, what a privilege it was to have spent so many hours with this aging lion of a man. He had won so many conquests, had done so much in civil rights, and yet felt in the end as if his career had been destroyed by the war in Vietnam. So I had those hours with him, and it was an extraordinary experience. I think it's what propelled me to want to understand the inner person behind the public figure that I've tried to bring to all these books since then.
When was this photograph taken?
Oh, God. This is when I was selected as a White House Fellow. That must have been the days when women wore chignons. That false hair is in the back of my head. It's a very embarrassing photo, but that was at the celebration when the White House Fellows were announced. And what happened weirdly was that I did dance with President Johnson when we were selected, but had been a graduate student when I was selected at Harvard. And like many young people active in the anti-Vietnam War movement, So I had written an article against Johnson, which unfortunately came out after being selected as a White House Fellow. And the theme of the article was how to get rid of Lyndon Johnson in 1968. I was sure he would kick me out of the program, but instead, surprisingly, he said, oh, bring her down here for a year, and if I can't win her over, no one can. So I did end up working for him and then helping him on his memoirs.
You mentioned the dance in the book, Lyndon Johnson, The American Dream. He said, he came up to you, he said, do you dance up at Harvard? And he said, you said, of course they do. Bull, he responded. I know what goes on up there, and I bet they can't dance like I'm dancing with you right now.
Absolutely, and then he twirled me around the floor. He's so big, and he also had this weird habit of standing closer to human beings than normally people stand separated. So I felt like I was in his chest half the time when I was talking to him, and when I danced, he literally picked me up from the floor going around the room.
Let's get to some phone calls for Doris Kearns Goodwin. First up is Oberlin, Ohio. Good morning.
Oh, good morning. I just purchased the book 2 days ago. I'm into the first 200 pages of it. Huge fan of Lincoln. My question is Lincoln's ability to reach out to his political rivals and incorporate them into a larger scheme. Would you comment on the seeming impossibility of that happening now?
It's a great question. I think it would be much harder now. I mean, because now we have this permanent campaign, so the minute a president is elected, he's already thinking of the second term. In Lincoln's day, most presidents, for the previous presidents, had just had a single term, so they're not so obsessed about winning. And today I think they'd be worried about giving a platform for their rival that they could then use against them in the following 4 years. The other thing is that these guys were all rivals of one another, not just of Lincoln. So they said terrible things about one another. You'll see as you get further in the book. Unmitigated scoundrels. Stanton and Chase half the times weren't talking to Postmaster Blair. They wouldn't go to each other's offices. Can you imagine what it would happen tonight if we were to hear on the news these guys in the cabinet saying these things about each other? It would explode the whole thing unless you had a Lincoln to hold it together. I wish it were possible, though, because what it meant was that he had all the different aspects of the Republican Party, moderates, conservatives, liberals, together in the same tent, so it was easier somehow to deal with them than it would have been if they were outside.
This morning in the Washington Post, in the review of the book, they say it would be comparable to George W. Bush selecting John McCain as defense secretary.
Exactly, as his chief person, knowing that he was giving a platform the first time around to McCain to one second time. But you know what? It might have been a great thing. If you have people who are going to oppose you, who are going to argue with you, who are going to debate you inside your cabinet, then maybe you hone your skills and you're able to deal with the country. And if you do well with the country, don't worry about the next election. It'll probably come to you.
Kansas City, Missouri, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you very much for taking my call. I was wondering if there's any historical documents about how Lincoln dealt with some of the savagery that happened as a byproduct of the Civil War from the Southerners, like the Quantrell's Raiders and things of that nature that did a lot of butchery. Did Lincoln do anything at all to try to stop it, or how was his feelings about those kinds of rivalries?
Oh, it's a very good question, and I think it's one of the things that was very hard for Lincoln, as so it should have been. At some point, they decided in the North that the only way the war could finally be won was if indeed the Southern capacity to make war were destroyed, which meant destroying the railroads. This is Sherman's March to the Sea in particular, destroying the crops and the cotton that was being sold to make money in order to keep the South in the war. And I suspect from what we see from the Lincoln's conversations with people, as much as he knew that that was a terrible byproduct of war, he figured unless the Southern capacity to make war were destroyed, it would keep going on and on and on. Even more people would die if he didn't do that.
Let's turn our attention to another former president. What role did you have in writing this book or working on this book with Lyndon Johnson, The Vantage Point?
Well, I was just one of a series of people who helped him on his memoirs, and particularly worked on the civil rights chapters and the chapter of his relationship with Congress, which is the best part of Lyndon Johnson. So I went down to the ranch, stayed with him at the ranch, sometimes stayed in Austin while I was beginning to teach at Harvard. And as I say, it was just to listen to him recollect. He was a great storyteller. I used to just listen for hours as he would tell me stories, not just about the part of the Vantage Point, but stories about his childhood, because he was originally going to write a trilogy, starting with the presidency, going back to the Senate, and then to his childhood. So a lot of our conversations would range over his whole life. I used to tease that his stories were so fantastically colorful, even though half of them weren't true. I loved them nonetheless.
Well, that was my question. How much could you believe?
Not a lot, but I think that's why he liked me there, because I liked listening to his tall tales.
Let me read you what Rick Perlstein wrote in History News Network. He said, I wonder how Doris Kearns, who ghost-wrote much of Lyndon Johnson's 1971 memoirs, The Vantage Point, felt upon its publication to be listed in the preface as merely one of a dozen of people who aided in the preparation, research, writing, and editing of this book.
Oh, there's no way that I ghost-wrote it. Absolutely not. No, in fact, there were far more important people working on that memoir than I was, and they spent more time. They were doing it full-time. I was just doing it part-time and only worked on those 2 chapters. And all that meant was that he talked to me, and then you put down what he says and try and get it in some form. So no, I thought that was more than enough, recommendation for what I had done. Absolutely.
Quote from Lyndon Johnson. After he took the oath of office, he said, I became president, but for millions of Americans, I was still illegitimate. A naked man with no presidential covering, a pretender to the throne, and then there was Texas, my home, the home of both the murderer and the murderee.
Johnson always spoke in somewhat graphic language. You can only imagine what it must have been like for him to know that the country had loved John Kennedy so much, must have wondered, did he have something to do with his assassination because it took place in Texas, and then the murder of the murderer, as he said. What was amazing was that even with all of that pressure on him, he achieved an extraordinary transition, and then the next year, 1965, was one of the great years in American history. So if he only hadn't gotten into Vietnam, I think he would have been remembered as a great president.
Next call comes to us from Ann Arbor, Michigan on Book TV. Go ahead, please.
Yes, is this Doris Kearns Goodwin?
It surely is.
You're my hero.
Well, thank you so much.
I dropped out of school, Professor, and then I went back and I started studying history. I went back to the community college, and the more I learned about it, the more I really warmed up to it. And what gets me is how historians can look at something and they can differ in their interpretation. If they're like economists, you get them in a room and they don't agree. But I wanted to ask you about how exactly do historians go about gathering evidence. And one thing that always struck me about President Lincoln, this is just a layman's observation, it seems like he had the ability to look outside of himself and to see how other people saw him. And I always kind of wondered about that. And then lastly, what about these charges of that you hear in the news about, like Stephen Ambrose, like plagiarism and stuff like that? And I'll hang up, and God bless you and thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I think just to answer your Lincoln question, I think you're absolutely right that his ability to look at himself from the outside in, it's stretched, I think, from this enormous confidence that he had inside himself and also a remarkable sense of humor. I think anyone who's funny and has a sense of humor, part of it is the ability to laugh at oneself, and I think that was a great quality in him. What happens when historians write history is that we go back and we look at as many primary sources as we can, which means using the diaries, using the letters, using oral histories, and then you try to figure out from yourself, you're going to read different conflicting ideas of what somebody did. You just have to intuitively understand, you know your guy, how do I think he responded, how do I think he didn't respond? And in terms of your last question, it's a complicated process putting together a huge book like this, or any of our books, as was true for Stephen Ambrose as well. There's usually thousands of footnotes, lots of different sources, and sometimes what can happen, as happened to me as well, is that even though I had given absolute credit to the person from whom I had taken some passages and not put the correct quote marks in the right place, I'd credited her. Once I found out about it, I myself said that she was right. I corrected it in the next edition and then moved on. But it's part of the process, which is a complicated one, of doing a huge historical work, but it's worth every cent to be able to put all those sources together and give a narrative, hopefully, to the reader that can make the people come alive.
For you personally, what was the biggest lesson after the revelation came out from this book, The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys?
I think the biggest lesson was that you acknowledge the era. I mean, I acknowledged it at the time. I corrected it to the author's satisfaction. When it became public again 3 years ago, I acknowledged it again. There's nothing you can do to change the past other than to make sure that, like, for example, in this Lincoln book, everything is checked and everything is fine. So that's what can you do other than do that?
There are 100 pages, 100 plus pages of footnotes and bibliography?
Well, I think the reason for that would have been true even if this hadn't happened, because there's so many primary sources and there's something about the Lincoln world they're a very generous group of scholars, the people who've studied Lincoln all their lives. So when you found new things, you want to put in the footnote for those other scholars sources that they can look at for themselves. So it's really, in a certain sense, a sharing process. And all those notes, I think the Lincoln scholars will be happy. And hopefully, 100 years from now, some young scholar will say, yes, I found a source because it was there.
You wrote in an essay to Time magazine after it was revealed in January of 2002 that it also taught you about your own fallibility.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, there's no way that you can be perfect in anything. I'd like to believe that in most of my books, what I've been able to do is to deal fairly with the characters, to never have a bias toward them, not to be mean toward them, but you also want to make sure that you've credited every source, everything's fully and appropriately done, and so you learn about that and you make sure to do it right.
Let me ask you about the Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, because it was delayed by about 2 years because of some new documents that you found. What were they?
Oh, what happened was that it turned out that Teddy Kennedy gave me access to 150 cartons that had been in the attic in Hyannisport for over 50 years. And it turned out that Joe and Rose Kennedy had saved almost everything. Every letter that they wrote to one another, check stubs, movie cards, letters from the family. And it was really a way into the Kennedy family that I wouldn't have had without those, so it was worth spending another couple years. I mean, that book took me almost 10 years, too. I'm not too fast on these things.
And you write in the book that had times been different, Eunice could have been the politician in the family.
There's no question about that. I mean, she was the one. It's interesting. There were 3 kids at the top of the family, Joe Jr., Jack, and Kathleen, and they were considered like the golden trio, everything right for them. Then, of course, there was the retarded daughter, Rosemary, and then came Eunice. And Eunice was sort of like the person who took care of everybody else in the family and the closest one to Rosemary. She had intensity, she had drive, and in some ways, I think she was the leader of that younger group of generations of the Kennedys. And they often said if she had been a boy, she would have been the one who ran for office in 1946, much more outgoing than was Jack Kennedy, but it wasn't that time and age. But she's done remarkable things with the Special Olympics and with her commitment to mental retardation as a result.
And what did you learn about Kathleen, who died in the plane crash in 1947?
Well, she was the rebel in the family in a certain sense. I mean, she went over to Europe with her father. She fell in love with the Duke of Hartington, the Duke of Devonshire, Billy Hartington, and she married him even though he was Protestant, and then fell in love yet again with another Protestant after he died in the war. She was beautiful, she was feisty, and I think had her own life apart from the Kennedys more than most of the other family members did.
In the book, and I'm trying to find the quote, but you'll probably say it better than I can say it, you write about how Joe Sr. came down and told his family on the death of Joe Jr.
It was a blow, I think, for Joe Sr. that was never to be restored. I think he was forever altered by that. Joe Jr. was the one that they thought would be the President of the United States, much more socially at ease than Jack was when he was younger, more handsome, if you can possibly imagine that, and all the family's hopes were put on him. When Joe Sr. found out that he'd been killed in a plane crash in World War II, I don't think people thought he would survive. Rose had her faith. She had her love with God. She knew that somehow Joe Jr. was with God and she would be with him someday. But Joe Sr. said he wasn't so sure about that, and he didn't know whether he could take this thing. It was like a break that would never be restored in the family.
What did the Kennedy family members tell you about that afternoon?
Well, I think what Rose said was, I mean, somebody came to the door to tell them, and there was a sense of not wanting to believe it, which must be true, I guess, for anybody who hears about a son or a daughter being killed in the military. But you know the minute that somebody comes in what they're about to tell you. And they finally separated and tried to make the best of it. And then what happened that helped Rose a little bit, a lot of Joe Jr.'s friends and colleagues and people who'd been in the military with him wrote letters to her and told her what a wonderful leader he was and how great he was. So that gave a certain solace, I suspect.
Next call comes to us from Phoenix. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, through my nervousness, I'm going to ask 2 or 3 quick questions and then hang up and listen.
Don't be nervous.
We'll take it one at a time.
Okay, number one, you said you try to write these books, and by the way, even though you were accused of some things, every time you're on, I watch you. I find you
thank
very
you so much.
And I think that you give in credit to President Johnson. Everybody thinks Kennedy did all of these things to help the poor and the minorities, but it was actually President Johnson, and he doesn't get the credit. But going back to Lincoln, I don't understand. You said you try to write these biographies without biases. Lincoln raped and tortured the United States Constitution more than any other president in the history of man. habeas corpus, locking up newspaper writers, jailing people who spoke out against him. I'm talking about people in the North, not in the South. I haven't read your book. Did you include that? Did you include the fact that he violated the United States Constitution, that he should have been, if George Bush did that now, people would be calling for impeachment. Abraham Lincoln wanted to centralize the United States government. Personally, I think slavery I'm a Christian. I believe it was an abomination. I think it's the worst sin this country's ever committed against itself. But I believe slavery could have been reconciled through the North paying the South. But rather than that, and a lot of people don't realize it, when they sent the ship to Fort Sumter, it wasn't to say you can't have slaves. It was to say we're going to quintuple the amount of taxes that you're paying on cotton. And that's when the shots were fired. Lincoln violated the Constitution like no other president ever has before him or after him, and to me, that's one of the most important legacies of his administration. It's terrible when anybody is killed, but I can understand how somebody like John Wilkes Booth, who supposedly was from a good family and a very intelligent man and had good connections, would say, this guy is destroying the Constitution.
Thank you, caller.
Let me talk to a series of those things that you've said. What Lincoln thought he was preserving, and what he was preserving, was not simply the Union. It wasn't simply even emancipating the slaves. He believed that if the South were allowed to secede, that the whole experiment that was democracy would be destroyed. The South would secede, slavery would stay in the South, and then maybe the West would secede from the East, and everyone in the world would be delighted that this beacon of hope that America represented, that ordinary people could govern themselves, would be undone. So it was something very large that he was fighting for. There's no question that in wartime civil liberties suffer. There's no question that when he undid habeas corpus, he had his reasons for doing it. What happened is that the troops were coming to protect Washington. People in Maryland were preventing them from getting there, so he needed to do something, he thought, to get the troops there or the whole cause would be lost. But nonetheless, that's not an excuse. In wartime, somebody said, Justice Marshall said, even in times of the most urgency is when you need to be most protective of the Constitution. But without that Civil War, slavery would have continued, but more important than that, people thought at least until the 20th century it would have continued, and it was, as you say, an abomination. But even more, as I say, if the South had been allowed to secede, then everything we stood for in the world and still stand for would have been undone. Lots of people had to die. It's a terrible thing they had to die. Wartime is a mess. War is hell, as somebody said. But I think most historians would argue that that was one of those wars that had to be fought, as sad as it was.
Page 735, the chapter The Final Weeks, you write, just as Brutus had been honored for the slaying of the tyrant Julius Caesar, John Wilkes Booth believed he would be exalted for killing an even greater tyrant. Assassinating Lincoln would not be enough. Booth knew, his biographer observes, that in the end, the Brutus conspiracy was foiled by Mark Antony, whose famous oration made outlaws of the assassins and a martyr of Caesar. And then, to paraphrase William Henry Seward, was Lincoln's Mark Antony.
Right. I mean, what I hadn't fully absorbed until I got deeply into this was that John Wilkes Booth had a triple assassination plot. It wasn't going to be enough to kill Lincoln because he wanted to decapitate the entire structure of Northern leadership. So he had a co-conspirator that was going to assassinate Andrew Johnson, the vice president, but the guy got to the hotel and started drinking and never quite got to the vice president's hotel to kill him. But the third assassin, Lewis Payne, did get to Seward's house. Seward lived in Lafayette Park right across from the White House, and he had just broken his jaw a week or so before and was in bed with his jaw wired up. So the assassin came in pretending that he had medicine for Seward. He made his way upstairs. Seward's son was at the top of the stairs, wouldn't let him into the bedroom. He then hit Seward's son with a revolver, made him fracture his skull and go into a coma, went into the bedroom and had a Bowie knife, which he slashed Seward's other son with, the nurse's aide, went to Seward's bed and slashed his entire cheek off. The only thing that prevented his dying was that he had this wire from his jaw. He then ran down the stairs and slashed two more people, a bloody massacre in that house. So what he was hoping, just as you suggest, is that if he could somehow undo the vice president, the president, and the secretary of state, that maybe it would give hope to the dying Southern cause at that last moment.
And you write in the epilogue that he survived, his son survived, but 6 weeks later, Frances Seward was dead.
Yeah, she's one of the great characters in this book. She was a woman way ahead of her time, Frances Seward. Very, very smart, very idealistic, always pushing Seward to do what should be done rather than what could be done. And I found a fragment in her paper. She was always frail. A lot of these 19th century women had these various vapors. One never could figure out what they were. But she somehow had this frail constitution. And after she tended to her husband and her son for weeks, they were in difficult situation. They started getting better. And she wrote in her papers that she never before had believed in vicarious suffering, but she thought maybe she had taken on their illnesses and that she was going to die. And she died sort of inexplicably 6 weeks later.
The book is called Team of Rivals, The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln, the latest by Doris Kearns Goodwin. Next call is Matthews County, Virginia. Go ahead, please.
That you kind of gave this question to Mrs. Goodwin at the beginning, but my question is, how does she come to something fresh in the Lincoln biography? You know, David Herbert Donald, so many other Lincoln scholars. How does someone find something fresh? And then my next question is, there's an African-American, I'm also African-American, wonderful historian who wrote a book about Lincoln entitled Forced into Glory. I was wondering, can a particular racial bias or gender bias come into one's writing, and is that something fresh that a historian, a woman historian, could bring to Lincoln that maybe some of her male counterparts could not bring?
Oh, I like to think that's possibly so. I mean, as I say, when I first started, I had no full faith that I could find something fresh, and I think nothing mattered more to me than when David Herbert Donald, the great Lincoln biographer of this generation, read the book and said that it was in print, said it was as fresh as if it were the first book on Lincoln ever published. I mean, that's all I needed to hear forever. But I think the only thing that gave me a chance to possibly say something fresh was that all these guys that I now call my guys, Seward, Stanton, and Chase, and Bates, because they kept diaries, they were gossiping about Lincoln and about each other. They had insight into Lincoln that hadn't always been used in Lincoln biographies. And I think because I care about their wives and their families, I tried to make them into full human beings, not just policymakers with Lincoln. So it may be that that is partly a woman perspective. As I say, in the 19th century, they didn't even think about wives and families. But I think your question about forced into glory is also an interesting one, because there's been some comments in recent years that Lincoln did say some racist things in the 1850s when he was debating Stephen Douglas. And it's true, he wasn't sure that blacks could actually be on juries, could vote. He wasn't sure they could ever achieve equality in the United States. It was kind of a brooding quality to his statements about this, as if, not that he didn't wish this would happen, but he wasn't sure we were ever capable of that. And I think what it shows is that there was just a pervasive racism in the country as a whole then, very little belief, even among abolitionists, that blacks could be equal to whites. And it's a sad commentary, I think, on where America was. And even more so, it's taken 150 years, even beyond that, for us to get to the point where we finally broke down segregation, gave blacks the right to vote, and still have prejudice in this country.
When did Mary Todd date Stephen Douglas?
Mary Todd was the belle of Springfield when she was a young girl. So it would have been, you know, when she was probably 20, 22 years old. He was in Illinois, and they all were in the same circle. Even Lincoln and Douglas had been in the same circle when they were young. I love to think of Mary Todd when she was a young girl, because there's so much sadness in her later life that we tend to think of her as that older woman who lost 3 of her 4 children. Of the 4 children, 1 died at 3 years old. Little Willie died in the middle of the Civil War at 10. Tad, her youngest son, died at 18, and then she was eventually put into an asylum by her oldest son, Robert, because he didn't think she was stable enough to live on her own. But when Lincoln first met her, when she was dating Stephen Douglas, she was feisty, conversationalist, intelligent, well-educated. She loved poetry and loved politics, which is very unusual for a young woman at that time. And there's this wonderful story when Lincoln first saw her. He came up to her, seeing her with all her bows stretched around her. "Mary, I would love to dance with you in the worst way." And then she laughingly said, "He certainly did." He was rather awkward, I think.
But after they were married, she had said that, quote, she considered Stephen Douglas to be a little giant by the side of my tall Kentuckian, and intellectually, my husband towers over Douglas just as he does physically. When did she say that?
Well, she said that during the period of the 1850s, when he was going to be not only the opponent in 1858 for the Senate race, but was going to be an opponent in 1860 as well for the presidential race. And he had been called, Stephen Douglas was very short and rather bull-looking, so he was called the Little Giant because he had a huge head and was very, very smart. But I think Mary believed in Lincoln early on, which is really quite something. I mean, again, historians have been unkind to her in a lot of ways, but she was his partner in the 1850s. She had faith in him. I don't think he needed her to give him ambition, as some people have suggested. He had all the ambition in the world because ever since he was young, he wanted to accomplish something so worthy that his story could be told after he died. That would have carried him through even if he'd never married anybody, I think.
Speaking of rivals, did he have any dealings with Stephen Douglas when he became president?
Yes, a wonderful thing happened in the terms of their relationship. After he became president, Stephen Douglas, and once the war had started, Douglas was close to dying at that point, but he came to the White House and offered his complete services to Lincoln, which meant that he, a former Democrat, or a Democrat at the time, was saying, this is not a time for partisanship, I'm with you. And that's a moment to remember because it's the last time the two men saw each other before Douglas died a few months later.
What was he suffering from?
He had had, presumably, difficulties with alcoholism during his life, with drinking a lot, and his body, I think, was just ravaged by the terrible pressures he put it through. Unlike most people at that time, I'm not sure if he was an alcoholic, but he did ravage his body. During that time, very few candidates actually stumped on their own. It wasn't considered dignified, but Douglas had gone all over the country in 1860 trying to win that election, and I think just his body wore down.
How did you go about putting all of this together? You refer to the books that, and we'll later in the program show your library in Concord, Mass. But the process of writing this.
Well, you know, I once read an essay by the great historian Barbara Tuchman, who said it's important when you're writing, especially if you're doing a lot of research and it's going to take a long period of time, not to get paralyzed by doing too much research before you start writing. Because otherwise, like if I'd gone on for 5 or 6 years doing research and hadn't written a word, I might have said, oh no, what am I going to do? So instead, as soon as I knew that I was going to be writing, and it took probably a couple years to figure out that I would write about these rivals. I also was working on that little memoir on growing up in love with the Brooklyn Dodgers. So I was doing research on Lincoln, writing about the Brooklyn Dodgers, which was a great combination. But anyways, once I figured out that I had this storyline, I knew that I wanted to start it in May of 1860 on the day that the four rivals were waiting to hear the news that they had been nominated for the presidency of the Republican Party. So I actually wrote that chapter years and years ago just so I had a beginning. And then I knew I was cycling back to their earlier lives to bring them back up to that point. So I made sure to do all my research on their childhood, their young adulthood, and their earlier lives so I could write that section. So each time I got to a chapter, I would, maybe spend a month or so working additionally on it to make sure I had everything in place and then write that chapter. And that's why it stretched out to 10 years.
Our Book TV bus is traveling around the country, and one viewer in Madison, Wisconsin has this question for Doris Kearns Goodwin.
I'm Judy Moore from Madison, Wisconsin, and my question for Doris is, do you remember any specific teachers that taught you to love the stories of history, and could you tell us about them?
Absolutely can. I think in some ways I had some wonderful teachers in high school. There was a woman named Miss Austin who actually, I went to school in Long Island, New York, and she won an award as the best history teacher in New York State. And what was so great about her was that she made us feel like she really cared passionately about these people. When she wrote and told us about Franklin Roosevelt, she had loved him, and when she talked about his death, she cried. When she talked about the civil rights movement in the 50s, there was a sense of her involvement in it all. And she was a dignified, wonderful woman. And then when I went to Colby College in Maine, I had this incredible teacher named Al Mavernack, who just somehow was so involved in political theory and government and politics that, again, he made you feel even that Plato was alive when we were learning about Plato. So I think there's no question that what history teachers, when they are good, can do is to make you realize that you're not reading about people who are dead and long gone and who have no interest and no relevance to your present day life. You're reading about people who had passions, who had learnings, who had problems, who had loves, who had lives. And if you can feel their life again, just as you feel the people living in your own lives, they come alive, and then you really do care about history. And I was lucky enough to have those two great teachers.
In writing Wait Till Next Year, what did you learn about yourself?
I think the most important thing for me in writing that book was because my parents died when I was young, my mother when I was 15 and my father when I was still in my 20s, it was as if somehow they were not alive in my life in quite the same way, except all the stories that I had told to my children. And to be able to share their lives with the people who would read the book meant so much more to me than I thought. I thought I would simply be writing a book about baseball somehow. But I think the more I realized it, when I remembered the fact that my father, in some ways, was the first teacher I ever had, because, as I've often liked to say, he taught me how to keep score when I was only 6 years old. So when he went to work in New York during the day, I could record for him the history of that afternoon's Brooklyn Dodger game. Now, when your dad comes home, and every single night he spends 2 hours with you, as I now realize that I, in excruciating detail, recounted every single play of every inning of the game that had just taken place that afternoon, makes you think there's something magic about history. And in fact, I'm convinced now, and I don't think I knew it till I wrote the memoir, that I learned the narrative art from those sessions with my dad, because at first I would blurt out, "The Dodgers won," or "The Dodgers lost," which took much of the drama of this 2-hour telling away. So I learned you had to tell a story from beginning to middle to end.
One of the photographs in the book, a young Doris Kearns, your sister Charlotte, and you look a lot like your mom.
I'd like to think so. You know, I mean, it's so hard. It's so many years now from the time when she died. But the memories of her having taught me how to love reading, because she was an invalid. She had had rheumatic fever as a child, and she was not really able to leave our house very much, and had the arteries, her doctor said, of a 70-year-old when she was only 30 years old. But every night she would read to me as long as I could stay awake, that childhood dream of never having to go to sleep. And weirdly, I think the only thing I loved as much as her reading to me was listening to stories about her girlhood. I somehow became obsessed with the idea that if I could keep her talking about the days when she was young and healthy before the rheumatic fever set in, that somehow this aging process we were witnessing would be stopped in its tracks. So I would constantly say to her, "Mom, tell me a story about you when you were my age," not realizing how peculiar that was until I had my own 3 sons. Never once have they said to me, "Mom, tell me a story about you when you were our age."
She read slowly and deliberately, lingering over the passages she liked, helping me feel the rhythm of the language, the pleasure of well-chosen words. She modulated her voice to reflect the different characters and the pace of their narration. And you also said that her voice was softer than yours.
Right, right. Well, I have a very loud voice. She used to tease me that when I'd be out with my friends playing on the street, she could hear me wherever I was. So I'm afraid I was never very shy or never very quiet.
How did you get the nickname Bubbles?
Well, my father liked to think that I was enthusiastic about things, and I would sort of get excited whenever we were going someplace, or excited to go to a ball game, or excited about anything. So he thought that was a bubbly thing. So it was kind of embarrassing, though, when he would write me letters at camp, "Dear Bubbles," and then everybody knew what he was calling me.
And you brought along a photograph that is also in the book, Wait Till Next Year, your home.
You know,
what street was it on?
It was on Southern Avenue in Rockville Center. What was wonderful in those days is the homes were so close to one another with this tiny patch of lawn, so that my best friend had a window right next to mine across this narrow driveway. We could talk to each other at night when we were supposed to be asleep.
Was your bedroom on the second floor?
It was indeed. It was indeed. Hers was on the second floor right there. And you know, in those days in New York in the 1850s, in the 1950s, I'm not that old, in the 1950s, there were giant Dodger and Yankee fans all together. She was a Yankee fan, I was a Dodger fan. Across the street were Giant fans. Baseball was the abiding passion, and it was shared by everybody on the block.
Michael Francis Aloysius Kearns.
Is that a great name, my father's name? I'll tell you, that man I loved so much. I mean, he had had such a difficult childhood. He grew up in Brooklyn. His father was a fireman. He had had a little brother who was 6 years old when he was 10, a little sister who was 2. His mother was pregnant, and his mother died, and then his little brother was hit by a trolley car. He was left with his little sister, and his father eventually killed himself. And his little sister, when she was 16 years old, died in the dentist's chair from some faulty anesthesia. Now, you would think that that would create a man who didn't have a life force in him and had a sad mentality or a melancholy spirit. He was the most optimistic, outgoing, twinkle in his eye. Somehow he not only survived, but he gave affirmative life to all of us. It was the gift he gave to me to love life that I will never forget him for.
You write a lot about your first Holy Communion in the book. Was that a defining moment growing up?
Well, it certainly was a defining moment because 2 things had happened. One is that right before my Holy Communion, Roy Campanella, the Dodger catcher, came to my town. I was so excited. It would be the first time I'd ever see a Dodger player outside of Ebbets Field. However, it was announced that he was going to speak in a Protestant church. And now when you're brought up as a Catholic, you think, if you step foot in a Protestant church, you'll be struck dead at the threshold. So I went into the church, however, with my father the night. He said, "Don't worry about it. He's speaking in a parish hall. We're sitting in chairs, and it's going to be fine." But I was worried still that I had somehow traded the life of my everlasting soul for this night with Roy Campanella. So when I went to my first confession, I had to tell the priest what I thought might have been a sin. I told him right up front, I figured strategically get it over with. But the priest told me exactly what my dad had said. Don't worry, it's not a sin, you weren't in a religious service. But then, unfortunately, he said, and what else, my child? And then I had to acknowledge that I wished harm to others. Namely, I wished various New York Yankee players would break arms, legs, and ankles so the Dodgers could win their first World Series. And I remember the priest said to me, how often do you make these wishes? And I had to say, every night when I said my prayers. But then he said to me, look, I love the Dodgers as much as you do. You don't have to wish harm on others to make them win. Someday they will win fairly and squarely. Do you understand? Oh, yes, I said. And then as I left, luckily, he was a baseball-loving priest. He said, say a special prayer for our Brooklyn Dodgers. So no way to forget that First Communion.
1949 and 1957, the 9 seasons included the Dodgers, the Yankees, and the Giants, one of them competing for the World Series. And then the Giants and the Dodgers left in a short period of time, did they not?
Did they not? Oh, boy, I'll tell you, it was such a blow to those of us who loved baseball. Every year we would argue who's the best center fielder, who's the best first baseman, and suddenly these two teams were gone. Walter O'Malley, who took them away, became like a tyrant in our community. I didn't follow baseball again for so many years, so saddened by the loss of the Dodgers, until I finally moved to Harvard College and went to Fenway Park and then became an irrational Red Sox fan.
Let's get our next call from San Diego. Go ahead, please.
Well, I was wondering about this theory that's just come out that in another book that Lincoln was a depressive. I just find that very hard to believe as someone who's had some experience in my family with depression. There's just not the energy, I don't think, to overcome it the way this theory says that Lincoln did. And I wondered what your findings on that and what you think about Lincoln having been a depressive.
You know, I came away with a somewhat different feeling. I think he was born with a melancholy temperament as opposed to an optimistic temperament. In fact, a great friend of mine, Jerry Kagan, has written a wonderful book studying children from 0 to 20 to show that you can tell early on which one of the two those children are. Life can change things, obviously, for them. But he understood well his sorrows and his melancholy, and he knew how to get himself out of it. He had a remarkable sense of humor. When he told a story, he could do that. He knew to go to conversation when he was lonely. Even in the presidency, when things were anxious, he would go to a play to be able to get his mind out of what he was doing. And there's really only 2 significant depressive episodes in his life. The first one after his great love first, Anne Rutledge, died, an understandable depression. Any one of us would have been in it. The second, when 3 things came together, and he seemed to feel like his life force was not going forward. He'd broken his engagement with Mary Todd. He had somehow lost his best friend, Joshua Speed, who was leaving town, and his political career seemed to be going down. And so he did fall into a depression so deep that people worried that he might be suicidal, and they took scissors and knives away from him. But he told his friend Speed at that time, you know, he said, I would just as soon die, but I haven't yet done anything to be remembered by. And I believe that dream powered him through all the failures in his life. And I totally agree with you that he had terrific energy. He was the one actually who sustained the people during the worst days of the Civil War more than his colleagues, more than his cabinet guys who weren't depressed. He was the one who kept them going. So I think being a melancholy temperament is different from having chronic depression.
An email from Bruce Tennant, Doris Goodwin from Long Beach, California, wondering, considering your close association with President Lyndon Johnson and with the release over the last couple of years of his White House tapes, how do you ultimately view his political acumen as compared to that of Abraham Lincoln?
I think there was a lot of similarities in their ability to make people come around to their point of view, but Johnson, of course, had a much more hands-on policy with the Congress. I mean, those tapes are just fantastic, showing, for example, in the 1964, when he was trying to get the Civil Rights Act through the Congress, the tapes show him talking to Everett Dirksen. Dirksen, of course, is the Republican minority leader. He knows he needs him to break the filibuster on the Civil Rights Act. And so at first he's promising him everything under the sun. You come with me, Dirksen, you'll get dams. You know, you have a feeling every part of Illinois will be filled with public projects. But then essentially what he says to him, you know, if you come with me on this bill, 99 years from now, the NAACP will be flying your banner. And in fact, then 200 years from now, he said, school children will know only 2 names, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen. So in other words, he knew how to persuade people to come to his side. And those tapes are fantastic. You know, there's a very funny story. When I was some years ago at a conference with the former CEO of Pepsi-Cola, Don Kendall, and he came over to me, he said, now I know you knew Lyndon Johnson when you were a young girl, but I have a story I bet you don't know. And he told me that when Nixon first got into the presidency, he asked Kendall to go to the ranch to talk to Johnson about some private matter. And he said Johnson was working on his memoirs, looked up grumpily and said, how am I supposed to remember what happened 20 years ago, 30 years ago? The only chapters that are any good at all are the ones where I had this little tape machine in my Oval Office. I used to press a button, verbatim conversations. So those chapters really come alive. So he says to Kendall, you go back and tell your good friend Nixon that there's nothing more important than a taping system. And thereby, Lyndon Johnson contributes to Richard Nixon's downfall. I love that story from Kendall.
In the book, you write about after he left the presidency, Lyndon Johnson said that how is it possible that all these people could be so ungrateful to me after I'd given them so much?
I think what hurt him the most was that he knew how much he had done for civil rights. He knew how much he had done for poor people. He knew he had done how much for education. And yet, in those last months and years of his presidency, his public opinion polls had gone down, and it seemed like people had forgotten all the great things he'd accomplished. I'd like to believe that before he died, he'd begun to sense some of that, but I don't think he did, sadly. I think if he had only lived a little longer, historians now are putting him higher and higher up in the public opinion, in the historians' polls, knowing that those great achievements, Medicare, aid to education, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, probably would not have happened without his great skill with the Congress.
But he only lived 4 years after he left the presidency. Did his depression begin on January 20th, 1969?
I believe it did. I mean, here was a man who was so intensely involved in public life and politics, he couldn't live without it. I mean, down at the ranch, he liked to replicate, in a certain sense, what he'd had at the White House, but no longer would there be meetings in the morning for which bills would go to which committee on the Hill. It would rather be which cows were going to get the itch medicine or which tractors were going to fix which fields. It just wasn't enough to sustain him. And you really felt, I did when I was talking to him, as if that will to live had been diminished. He had the most fantastic wife, Lady Bird Johnson, and I think loving her and loving those kids kept him going. But without that, I think he would have sadly just been happy enough to go away.
Lady Bird Johnson said that the chariot had turned into pumpkin and all the aides turned into mice.
Oh, wow, I don't know that statement. That's a great statement. She was the most remarkable woman. It wasn't easy to be with Lyndon Johnson, but she kept her dignity. And she once said to me, you know, I could have married some guy, a stockbroker, and lived in Austin, and maybe he would have been home at 5 at night. But Lyndon has shown me a world, and I'm very grateful for that. I remember one time that whenever he'd be going off on something or saying something crazy, like so-and-so is a member of the Communist Party, she could just put her hand on his knee and say, now, Lyndon, you don't really mean that. And all the tension would ease out of him.
Why did you write Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream?
I wasn't planning to write a book about him. It was just that he had spent such a long time talking to me about his earlier life. And then he died, obviously, before he was able to get back to his childhood or his Senate years. And I had all this stuff, and I wanted to be able to share it. And so that became my first book. I'd originally majored in constitutional law. I probably wouldn't have become a presidential historian had it not been for this privilege of working with him.
Now, there's a story somewhere that he crawled into bed with you.
I mean, I told the story. So here's what happened. I mean, he would wake up in the mornings, and in that loneliness, he wanted to talk. I mean, he just talked and talked. He couldn't bear being alone. Even when he took a nap, he wanted to have somebody sitting outside the room so that if he coughed, you know, he would know you were there. And so sometimes he would come into my room in the morning, and I would get up knowing he was coming in, and he would then bring the covers up to his cheeks or his chin and talk to me. And it was, as I say, a wonderful way to hear about the past, to see a person's ability to be an actual human being as well as the President of the United States. And he was a very powerful president.
I'd like to share with the audience the speech that he delivered, and there are 2 photographs from the book, The Vantage Point, his address in the Oval Office, and then the next day the headline in the Chicago Tribune, LBJ won't run. It was March 31st, 1968. It's just under 2 minutes. We'll roll that and come back and get the story behind his decision not to seek another term.
I have concluded that I should not permit the presidency to become involved in the partisan divisions that are developing in this political year. With America's sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president. But let men everywhere know, however, that a strong and a confident and a vigilant America stands ready tonight to seek an honorable peace and stands ready tonight to defend an honored cause, whatever the price, whatever the burden, whatever the sacrifice that duty may require. Thank you for listening. Good night, and God bless all of you.
Doris Kearns Goodwin, in your book, you say there was an air of euphoria in the Capitol the next day. Even Johnson seemed pleased. And then you tell the story about Johnson's visit with President Truman 2 months later, and President Johnson commenting on Truman's ability to make a decision and then stick with it, not to look back.
Yeah, I think just to go to the Truman thing, what Johnson so honored about Truman was when he had to drop the atomic bomb, that he made that decision on the basis of the best facts that were at his disposal. Maybe he might have made it differently if he'd known other things, but he never looked back. He didn't lose sleep. Whereas Lyndon Johnson, in those months and months before he left the presidency, would wake up every night and wonder about did the bombs drop in the right place? Have I done the right thing? He was tortured by that. And I think what happened that led up to this withdrawal was he began to feel that the only way maybe that the war would come to an end would be if he took himself out of the political process, because if he tried to negotiate a peace, people would say he was just doing it for his next election. And at that point, a president is thinking about history more than they are thinking even about winning another term. And at the same time, he felt like he was paralyzed, that people were not able to deal with the Congress in the way he was before. And he had a sense, he had had a grandmother who had had a stroke. And when he was a little kid, he was just terrified to watch her because she couldn't move. And he began to have a dream in those weeks before he withdrew from the race that he too had had a stroke and was lying in the Red Room just where Woodrow Wilson, who had had a stroke during his presidency, lay, and that he could hear all the advisors outside dividing up his power, taking it away from him, which symbolically was happening to him in those last months. And he used to have to wake up from the dream, he said, and go see Woodrow Wilson's picture on the wall to remind himself that Wilson was Wilson and that he was Lyndon Johnson. He did not have a stroke and he was alive. But I think metaphorically he felt that the political process was paralyzed because of the war, and that if he took himself out of it, maybe he could do better for the country, and maybe the country would remember him better.
What was that year like for you?
Well, what had happened is I had not originally started to work for him. I was put to the Labor Department after that article I wrote about him and worked for this wonderful man, Secretary of Labor Willard Wirtz. And after Johnson gave this speech, and then after Martin Luther King was killed a few months later, Johnson was going to make a major speech to the country on civil rights, just as he had after the Selma demonstrations. And Willard Wirtz was one of the people working on the speech, so giving ideas for it. So Wirtz and I had helped him a little bit on it. And I was so excited that he was going to do that, maybe turn civil rights in a positive way after Martin Luther King's death. And we had a function at the White House shortly after that. Johnson came up to me, and he always would say something to me. In that year we met him as White House fellows, will you ask me a question, as if he knew our past. And that day I just said, I wished you'd given this speech. And he teased me, he said, you're always criticizing me, aren't you? And then the next day he called up Willard Wirtz and said, I want her to come over here and work for me for the rest of her White House fellowship. And I was sorry to leave Wirtz. Interesting, I said, I don't want to leave you, because I thought he was great and I was no idea what I'd do in the White House. But Wirtz rightly said, you've got to take this chance. You've got to know him. So I went to the White House, worked from those last months of my White House fellowship, and stayed on until January '69 when he left. And mostly I just talked to him and listened to, mostly listen, not talk.
Springfield, Massachusetts, you're next for Doris Kearns Goodwin.
Yes, wonderful program. Thanks for C-SPAN. A couple of things, I guess. Growing up in Massachusetts as a Red Sox fan, I've had some pretty interesting confessions, especially in 1978 as a young man.
I know what you mean.
But actually,
keep that with your priest.
The reason I was calling was actually about Lyndon Johnson, about the things where he used the CIA to look into Martin Luther King's private life. It was kind of always wondered what a contradiction that was, because he was so ahead on civil rights. And what exactly was the thinking behind that, or was there any, or was it just I guess J. Edgar Hoover was a big part of this? So
I think you're right. I mean, I think J. Edgar Hoover was a force unto his own right, but that doesn't mean that the presidents didn't have a responsibility to rein him in. But that was Hoover's specialty, to look into the private lives of these public figures in case some dirt could be found so that they could be discredited if you didn't like what they were doing. You know, and for people like Hoover, the civil rights movement was a threat, partly because it might have meant a lot of people gathering together and there could be some violence, et cetera, but also maybe because they didn't like the substance of it. So even, you know, through Kennedy and through Johnson, there was this tendency to look into Martin Luther King just in case they might need something. And you're absolutely right. For somebody who believes in civil rights and had advanced it so much, the idea that that kind of civil liberties is being violated is not a tenable thing.
Since you brought up the Red Sox, can you explain this photograph?
Oh, this is the great photograph. Okay, this has a little bit of a story to it. The guy on the, there's a guy on the crutches, holding the crutches, is one of my sons, Michael, who's my middle son. And the person in the center is my youngest son, Joey. And Joey had just come back from Iraq at this point. He graduated from Harvard College in June of '01 in history and literature, and ended up, instead of going on to graduate school that fall after September 11th, ended up joining the Army instead for what will be a 4-year commitment with the 1st Armored Division. And as soon as he finished basic training and officers candidate school, he was sent to Iraq, where he was a platoon leader in a slum sector of Baghdad for a year. And after the 1st Armored Division left and went back to Germany, their home base, he came home to have his ACL operated on. That's why he's on crutches, because he had torn his knee. And the Red Sox found out that he had won a Bronze Star for valor while he was over there, so they invited him to throw out the first ball at Fenway Park. It was so funny. I mean, he said he was more nervous that night than when an RPG went 1 foot over his head, which was the first week parents learned that an RPG had gone over his head. And all week long, his guy friends are calling up. These Harvard kids are now, you know, investment bankers, so they were able to buy tickets on eBay. They all come back to watch him, and they're saying to him, "Joey, don't embarrass us. You better hit a strike." And I say to him, "Joey, it doesn't matter. You know, you're on crutches. You've just won a Bronze Star. They're going to have up there saying that you were in Iraq." And he said, "Mom, you don't understand. It's a guy thing." So all week on his crutches, he's practicing and somehow managed to hit the plate. It was a wonderful, he's as irrational as I am. Even in Iraq, he'd be staying up all night to listen to the Red Sox games when they were in the playoffs the year before.
How did you feel when they finally won the series?
It was astonishing. I mean, it still feels good. Believe it or not, I can wake up in the morning and I can still remember what it felt like. I mean, as a baseball fan, my whole life, I've only had 2 World Series. The Dodgers in 1955 and then the Red Sox in 2004. And maybe it's even better that way because it's more intense, although sometimes I wish my father had been born in the Bronx instead of Brooklyn. I would have been a lot happier. But nonetheless, there was something about that first World Series to share with my mother and my father, and then the second one to share with my 3 sons. The minute it happened, I mean, we were able to talk to Joey in Iraq, we were able to talk to our son Michael in Vermont and our son Richard in California, and that's what's so incredible about baseball. It really does allow you to go through the generations. You know, I've often said that sometimes when I sit with my boys at Fenway Park, now we have season tickets and I go to an unconscionable number of games, but I love it. And I can sit there with them and sometimes close my eyes and imagine that I'm a young girl once more with my father by my side at Ebbets Field with Roy Campanella down there, or Duke Snyder, or Pee Wee Reese, or Jackie Robinson. And somehow then when I see my sons sitting there where my father once sat, it's almost like an invisible loyalty and love that links them. They never saw my father, they never saw their grandfather, but through all the stories I have told, they've come to know his heart and soul. And baseball does that, and that's, I think, why I love it so much.
How do you think history will view the war in Iraq?
I think what's going to be very hard for the war in Iraq to be viewed in a positive way is whether or not there was a rationale for going in there, even forgetting the weapons of mass destruction, which clearly was not the rationale. But if there was a larger goal that the administration had in mind to create a stronghold of democracy in the Middle East, history will have to determine whether that was a good thing. If you don't tell the people what your purpose is, I think it's very hard for the people to sustain the support for the war. I mean, it's interesting, even Lincoln questioned the rationale for the Mexican-American War, saying that the President Polk had instigated for his own purposes. And that has always cast a doubt onto that war was very successful. We got a lot of territory, but there's questions about how we started it. But I think more importantly, even if one says the rationale was correct at some level, then obviously the fact that we hadn't prepared for it in well enough with enough numbers. I mean, when my son first got there, for example, it was right after mission was accomplished, and he had a peaceful reconstruction mission. He was so excited. He had an Iraqi translator. He was going into the Iraqis' homes. Within days, the security broke down. The looting had taken place. No more translator, no more Iraqi homes. And instead of a peaceful mission, which he had hoped to accomplish, he had 3 duties: checkpoint duty, weapon searches, and lastly, he had to take his platoon out as a target so the insurgents would shoot them so they could kill the insurgents in turn. But even saying all that, for him, he never second-guessed going into the Army. What a great decision it was. You know, here's a kid from affluent Concord, Harvard College. He's seen kids in a world he never would have seen, those 24 kids in his platoon, high school graduates only, and he melded with them. He became their leader, so he's a better man. I sometimes think we've lost something by not having the draft, because I think it makes men out of these young boys and women, and it makes everybody participate in the war. And I feel so sad when I see those individual people's names in the newspapers now, and know that the families don't have that same sense they did in World War II, that everybody knew somebody overseas. And I think we're going to have to rethink that if we're going to have these missions abroad.
Next call comes to us from Scotts Valley, California. Go ahead, please.
Yes. First, I have a comment and then two questions. The comment is, if people haven't read it already, No Ordinary Time is an excellent book.
Thank you very much.
And I really highly recommend it to everybody. My two questions, please jot these down. The first question is, and I haven't gotten your book yet, but I plan on doing so. Did you cover the massacre at Fort Pillow and President Lincoln's response to it? And the second question, how do you think President Lincoln would view the real possibility of a black woman becoming President of the United States in 2008?
Well, I can try and answer both questions. I did cover the massacre at Fort Pillow to some extent. I mean, what was so important about that is that after this massacre took place, this was a massacre of black soldiers at Fort Pillow, there was a call for retaliation so that we would somehow in the North begin to massacre Southern soldiers or Southern people in return for that. And Lincoln was very hesitant about that at first, because he didn't believe it was right to somehow retaliate against some individuals who may not have been part of the massacre. But finally, he did issue a retaliatory order and just hoped that it wouldn't have to be used, which indeed was pretty much what happened. And I think as far as what Lincoln would think about a black woman being president, he would be delighted. I think there's no question, as long as she shared the values that he thought. I mean, the most important thing he thought about a government that was a democracy like ours was that it somehow cleared away the artificial weights that rested on people that prevented them from rising to the level of their own talent. I mean, he saw himself in a way as an example of what was so extraordinary about America. He was able to push his way up to the top. But I think he would see in modern society, with the problems with education and the problems with poverty, that there are whole groups of people that cannot push their way up to the top, and would want to have somebody whose value was to help them go through that process so they could exercise, with whatever talents they have, discipline they have, hard work, to be able to get to the level of their ability.
Next call, appropriately enough, comes from Springfield, Illinois. Go ahead, please.
Greetings from Lincoln, Springfield.
Yes, indeed.
On the 145th anniversary of his election.
Oh, wow, I hadn't thought about that. That's right.
Yeah, pretty important. Doris, I have a brief statement and two questions. There is a stained glass depiction of Lincoln reaching out to Seward's friend, Archbishop John Hughes, in a Roman Catholic cathedral 6 blocks due south of the old state capitol. Now, is there any evidence linking the Archbishop with Seward's doctrine of higher law, and will Seward be vindicated with the confirmation of the 5th Catholic justice?
Oh boy, how interesting. I didn't know about that stained glass window, but Archbishop Hughes was a great friend of Seward's, and in fact, during the Civil War, went over to England and did some yeoman work for the administration by being over there. You know, it's actually very funny, when Seward was running earlier for the Senate, his great boss, Thurlow Weed, had also been a friend of Archbishop Hughes and had a picture of Hughes in his house. And when a whole bunch of nativists, you know, at that time there were a lot of people who were very anti-Catholic, came to his house, and he needed them to vote for Seward. And so he told them that Archbishop Hughes was simply some, you know, like George Washington in robe or something, that it wasn't really the Hughes of the Catholic religion. But what you're saying about the higher law is it's true, what Seward said in a famous speech in 1850. And what he was really saying was that there's a higher law even than the Constitution that would guide us toward anti-slavery. In other words, God's law or a morality law. And a lot of people were frightened by that thought. But there's a question of whether or not he was church and state. He would be kind of comfortable today in some ways with what's going on, because even as a young governor in New York State, he worried that the Catholics weren't getting enough education, that they were living in poverty. So he talked about public aid to these Catholic schools, something that again is very much in controversy today, but it hurt him at the time because the nativists wanted nothing to do with helping Catholics in any way.
Where was the wigwam in Chicago?
Oh, I don't know.
What part of the city, do you know?
I mean, it's not there now, so I don't know exactly. I mean, I probably knew when I wrote this book or when I finished it a couple weeks ago when it was, where it was exactly, but it doesn't exist in Chicago anymore. And it was constructed exactly for the convention. And they say it was called the Wigwam because the great chiefs met there, so they called it the Wigwam. And it was part of what allowed Chicago to get the convention, because they promised that they would build a structure precisely for it. What's amazing is when the committee, the Republican Committee, National Committee, met to figure out where they should hold the convention, Seward wanted it in New York, Chase wanted it in Ohio, Bates wanted it in Missouri, and since Lincoln was a dark horse, they all said, all right, let's have it in Illinois. We don't have to worry about anyone there. But Lincoln knew the importance of having it in Chicago, and in fact, he got the railroads to give discounted fares so people could get to Chicago, and then he was able to pack the hall with his supporters. And in fact, one of Bates' supporters later said, if we'd won it in Missouri and they lost by one vote, it's possible Lincoln wouldn't have been the president.
Two names that figure prominently, Lyman Trumbull and Norman Judd. Who were they?
Well, Lyman Trumbull ran against Lincoln for the first Senate race in 1855, and he had actually been a former, the Republican Party is made up of all these various elements, people who were former Whigs and former Democrats, former Liberty Party, and so in those days the state legislature is choosing the senator, and Lincoln had the majority of the votes, like 47, almost, all he needed was 5 more votes in order to win that nomination for the Senate in 1855. Trumbull's supporters, he was a former Democrat, were not willing to go with Lincoln, not that they didn't like him, but because he was a Whig. And so they held out and they held out and they held out, and it looked like there'd be a stalemate. And Lincoln was worried that if neither one of them won, that the third candidate who might win was more pro-Southern, more pro-slavery. So he turned all 47 of his votes over to 5 votes of Trumbull's, allowing Trumbull to become the senator. And his friends couldn't figure out how in the world can you do that. Mary was so upset with Trumbull's wife that she hardly spoke to her again in her life. But Lincoln went to his victory party that night, shook his hand, and as a result of not making an enemy out of a man like Trumbull, Trumbull and Norman Judd, who'd been one of those 5, become his great supporters in 1858 and again in 1860. And Norman Judd is a key figure in his winning the election in 1860. So it shows that if you somehow don't treat the people who hurt you in the past with enmity, but somehow can bring them back into your life, they will aid you later on.
And if I have this right, Stephen Douglas is the Democratic nominee. John Breckinridge is a Southern candidate. You also have the Know-Nothings, which held a convention nominating John Bell of Tennessee and Edward Everett of Massachusetts.
That's correct. So the Democratic Party was really split in 3. You had Lincoln as the Republican candidate, and then you have Douglas as the predominant Democratic candidate, but then these other 2 Union parties, so more conservative and different aspects. So that's one of the reasons why Lincoln was able to win the election, because of the split in the other party.
And what was the final vote count? Do you remember?
It was not very great. It was enough at the very end. What Lincoln was afraid of was that if New York, with its great electoral votes, went for Douglas, and it was very possible they might, because there were a lot of Irish Catholics in the cities, there were a lot of conservative merchants in the cities who wanted to keep trading with the South, didn't want slavery to be such an issue. And Thurlow Weed and Seward, who did yeoman work in New York, even though he was told, like at midnight, you've won the election, don't worry, he said, until I hear New York's totals, because if he'd lost New York, then it would have been thrown into the House of Representatives. There would have been no majority. So.
And you write in the book, and there's this sketching to characterize it, the assassination threats as president-elect. Why was this embarrassing to Abraham Lincoln? Not the assassination threat, but this caricature.
Well, what happened is he was told in Philadelphia that when the train passed through Baltimore, where there were a lot of secessionists, that there might be a mob attack on the train, and they thought he better go in the dead of night so that people wouldn't know he was coming through. So he did do that. He did not wear a Scottish cloak and outfit like this cartoon portrayed, but somehow the word got around that he had dressed up in this disguise, come into Washington under the dead of night, and it looked like here's the president-elect coming to Washington, and he can't even come on his own power. And he wished then that he had actually taken the risk and gone through Baltimore in daylight, even if the train had been attacked.
Las Vegas, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Hi, how are you doing today? The reason I called up, I in a letter on November 21st, 1864, Abraham Lincoln wrote, As a result of the war, corporations have become enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow. The money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its rule by preying upon the prejudice of the people until all wealth is concentrated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. I was wondering if you heard about that letter.
I don't know that letter. That's an extraordinary letter, though. Do you know who he wrote it to?
Actually, I don't. I picked it up in a book that I was reading one time, and that was the quote at the beginning of the chapter of the book.
Wow, I'd love to search that out.
It was on American history, and they had things you don't know about American history.
Well, you know, what is true is that obviously early on in the war, for example, they had to let contracts out to suppliers to make knapsacks and to make weapons and to make all sorts of, machinery for the war. And obviously middlemen made away with scandalous profits and produced knapsacks that fell apart in the rain and produced pistols that didn't work. So you could see some of the worries that we might have even today. But the interesting thing is that Cameron, who was then the Secretary of War, was about to be censured by the Congress for letting these contracts out to these companies at that time. And Cameron's whole career, he felt, would be destroyed forever. But Lincoln stood up for his first Secretary of War, wrote a letter to the Congress saying, if Cameron is at fault, all of us are at fault, myself and the entire cabinet. It was simply a problem in the early days of the war of the chaos, and we had to do something to start getting the weapons made, and mistakes were made. But there's no question but that war produces power, it produces centralized power, it produces more goods for corporations, and eventually what you're saying might be true, but I would love to find such a letter. That's fascinating.
Michiko Kakatani from the New York Times, in her review of the book that was dated October 25th, said that in Team of Rivals, and I'm just going to read a couple of sentences, she skims lightly over her subject's more pragmatic political maneuverings and his troubling utterances about race. Indeed, Ms. Goodwin's Lincoln often resembles Carl Sandburg's Man of Steel and Velvet, a wise and strong leader for the ages whose legacy, in Ms. Goodwin's words, belong not only to America but to the ages, to be revered and sung throughout all the time. Do you think you skim over his
I don't think so. I mean, I do think that I came away with a very positive feeling toward Lincoln. I don't think I could easily write about somebody like Hitler or Stalin, as some other great historians can, and live with him day by day, and that's partly why I chose him. But there's no question that he has flaws, and the flaws come out in the book. I mean, he was much too patient to General McClellan early on, kept him on too long. There's no question that his understandings of equality were not as spacious as one would have hoped, not even as spacious as Salmon Chase's were. And there's no question that there are other things he did, just as for Franklin Roosevelt. As much as I loved and revered him and respected him as a leader, his incarceration of the Japanese Americans was one of the greatest violations in civil liberties. His failure to bring more Jewish refugees into the country before Hitler closed the door forever was something that was sad. And the more you care about the person you're writing about, the sadder you are about their flaws. But every leader has flaws. But in Lincoln's case, I think most historians would argue that his overwhelming strengths are far greater than his flaws. And that's certainly what I found to be true as well.
Oberlin Park, Kansas, you're next.
Good afternoon. Thank you for taking my call. Ms. Kearns, if you were interviewing President Lincoln on C-SPAN, what would you ask him about his presidency? What would you ask him personally? And number 3, what would he say about how well people have viewed his place in history these many decades later in view of his modesty?
Oh boy, great questions. I mean, I think what I would ask him maybe about his presidency would be to talk to him about what he might have done after the war. I mean, that's the big unknown question of history. Had he lived, would Reconstruction have been different? How would he have treated the South? How would he have assured that Black Americans still had the rights, even as he brought the South back into the Union? Everybody wonders if Lincoln hadn't been killed as he was, would things have been different? So I'd love him to speculate on what he thinks he would have been like. But I think personally, if I had an hour with him, I would just say to him, please tell me some of your great stories. I mean, Lincoln was so much of a storyteller, so gifted, that that's part of how his rise to power took place. Even as a young lawyer, he would travel around the circuit for 2 months in the spring and 2 months in the fall. And when he went from courthouse to courthouse, if they knew he were in town, people would come from miles around to listen to him stand up by a fireplace and tell one story after another. And they say that that sad face of his, once he started telling a story, his eyes would sparkle and his whole life force would be shown. So I would just give anything to listen to him tell me one story after another. And then I think as far as your last question goes, what would he think about the fact that his name has stretched so far? I mean, I think Lincoln would be astonished. As much as he wanted to be remembered after he died, And as much as that dream powered him through all the failures in his life, and it was never simply for office or power, he wanted to somehow be able to say that he had made a difference in the lives of the people of his generation, which he surely did. But when I found, for example, and then I was able to end the book with it, a quote from Leo Tolstoy, the great storyteller of history, that made it seem that Lincoln's life had gone so much further than even Lincoln could have imagined, I bet Lincoln would have blushed. The story was that Leo Tolstoy went into the Caucasus, and it was some years prior to 1908, and this article was written in the New York World. And he went there and he met with a whole bunch of rude barbarians who hardly knew anything about the West. And they asked Tolstoy to tell stories of the great men of history. So he talked about Alexander and Frederick the Great. And they said to him, no, when you finished, you haven't told us about that man we most want to know about, that man who spoke with the voice of thunder, who laughed like the sunrise. Tell us of Abraham Lincoln. Tolstoy said he was astonished that Lincoln's name had reached into these rude barbarians who hardly knew about America. They said, all we know about America is it's this place that is so far from here that if we as youth journeyed there, we would be old men when we got there. And then Tolstoy concluded, why did they want to know? What had they heard about Lincoln? Why was he so great? He wasn't a great general like Napoleon, not a great statesman like Frederick the Great, but, Tolstoy concluded, he was a humanitarian as broad as the world, and it was his character that will last. And Tolstoy predicted that even 2 centuries from now, people would know more about Lincoln than we know then because it would last forever. I think if Lincoln heard that, it would make him so happy, but his modesty would say, that can't be true.
You have a sketch in the book of Lincoln's office in the White House. Where is that?
Well, what happened in those days is the office, and it was in the White House, the office and the cabinet room were the same. So unlike today where you've got the Oval Office and then you've got the cabinet room separate, there was a big long table where the cabinet would meet. It was a pretty simple setting. So he had a big chair that he liked to sit in. He had a desk where he sat in, and then this table where they'd all be arranged in terms of primacy. The Secretary of State sitting closest to the President, the Secretary of Treasury next in terms of which office was most powerful. But the incredible thing about the White House and his office in those days, a job seeker could race into the White House and simply go to Lincoln and talk to him. You know, this is the days before civil service. And then he also would have receptions in the White House where anybody could come, backwoodsmen or diplomats alike. The backwoodsmen, it was said, would drag their mud in. They would actually snip parts of the carpet to take home as a souvenir. And people on Lincoln's staff would say to him, Lincoln, you can't waste time talking to all these people. And he said, it's my public opinion bath. I need to do it. I need to remember the great popular assemblage from which I've come. You know, I think about that now in terms of, in recent decades, the White House has become so much of a cocoon, and it's so insulated, partly for security, but partly because of the way it's run. So that I think the reason we have these second-term blues with our presidents is that they have lost touch with the people. Their first election, they've just come from the people, and then the second election, they win it, and then all the people who have been with them have also lost touch with ordinary people. And Lincoln understood the importance of that. He had no problem. If public opinion polls were out today, he would listen to them. He wouldn't say they don't mean anything. He would educate and shape the public, hopefully not be constrained by it. But he used to say, with universal sentiment, anything is possible. Without it, nothing. In a democracy, the people's opinion matters. So he would try and keep touch, and he did that. He understood the mood of the people, just like FDR did. Somehow it's that intuitive, mystical sense that a leader has.
In today's day and age, though, we don't have any more recordings that we know of in the White House. We have emails and computers, maybe not as many letters.
Right.
How will historians look at this era 100 years from now?
I think it's going to be much, much harder for them to recapture what people were feeling and thinking. They'll have much more stuff to go through, which might indeed be paralyzing, but they won't have what you get in a diary entry or a letter. I mean, what a letter means usually, if you're writing to your wife or your daughter, you're keeping a diary, maybe you're sometimes thinking of history in the 1850s and 60s, but mostly you're just writing your raw emotions. And then you're reading them as an historian 150 years later, and you really can feel what they were feeling at that time. People aren't writing letters. The art of letter writing is no longer there. I mean, they taught each other how to write letters when they were young. Think of the fact that husbands and wives are away from each other so much of the time. You go on a trip to Europe, you're gone for a year if you're not with your husband or wife. So letters writing is the only means of communication. No phone, telegraph is certainly not going to do it. So they learned how to write letters in a way that I'm not even sure we know how to write. You know, when my son was in Iraq, and I tried to write him as often as I could, and here I am supposedly a writer, and it was hard to figure out what to tell him. I would finally reduce sometimes to thinking, well, Lincoln pardoned a soldier today who fell asleep, and that's what I would be reduced to telling him. Meanwhile, however, my other son, who was 14 months older than he, and who was in that picture that we saw earlier, holding his crutches when he threw out the ball at Fenway Park, He is himself wanting to be a writer. He wrote to his brother every single day, wrote a handwritten note every day. And you know, when you bring up your kids and the two of them are fighting in the back of the car when they're young, since they were almost like Irish twins, there was a sense in which once I knew that he and his brother had become that close, that's all that mattered. I knew we'd be gone someday, but they'd have each other.
Among the books by Doris Kearns Goodwin, Wait Till Next Year, which came out
in 1997.
And the Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, An American Saga.
1987.
And the latest, Team of Rivals. Next call is Santa Barbara, California. Go ahead.
Hi there. Great show, and I just wanted to get Ms. Goodwin's opinion on something. In Article 5 of the Constitution, it says that there's only two groups of Americans who can propose change to the country, and one group is Congress and the other is a convention. And right now in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, there's a federal lawsuit called Walker versus Members of Congress, and it shows that all the applications for an Article 5 convention are registered with Congress now, and they're failing to carry out their constitutional obligation and issue the call. And I was just wondering what you thought of that, and if you think it's time for an Article 5 convention.
You know, I don't know what you're talking about, and I'm interested to hear about that. I mean, you're absolutely right, though. I think the framers decided that since constitutional amendments were such an important process, there needed to be two possible ways of initiating them. One could be the Congress, or one could be these state conventions, as you say. In almost all cases in history, it's been a very onerous process to get through, which is why we have so few constitutional amendments. But they can be so important, the most important pieces in some ways of our government. The 10 Bill of Rights were amendments, and even during Lincoln's time, he did everything he could to get the Congress to pass the 13th Constitutional Amendment, which would undo slavery and then have it go out to the states, and he even tried to mobilize that as well. But it is important that there be no roadblock. If the people want to bring an amendment, whether it fails or succeeds, they should be able to do that. And I will look into what you're saying because I don't know about that.
How did Lincoln view the Constitution?
Well, it's interesting. Some people say that he had this dual feeling. I mean, he revered the Constitution. He revered the framers. I mean, those people that grew up in his generation, remember, they're not that far from the founding. Interestingly, when he was a young man, he gave this famous speech called the Lyceum Speech, where he worried that his generation didn't have the same challenges as the Founding Fathers, that they were the ones who'd established this fantastic government, and as a result they were remembered in mountains and rivers and streams, and he thought there's nothing left for our generation except to protect what they've done, modest ambitions. Of course, he never could have imagined that the anti-slavery movement in the 50s would lead to his becoming president, lead to a challenge in the Civil War even greater perhaps than that faced the Founding Fathers. But because he revered the Constitution so much, that's why it was hard for him. He could not have been an abolitionist in the 1850s, because the abolitionists, many of them said, tear up the Constitution. If it protects slavery as it does, because it protected the right of property in each state, then we don't care about the Constitution. He felt if that institution were to be gone, the Constitution, the whole framework that held the country together would be gone. But he really loved the Declaration of Independence. I think he saw that and its call for equality as something that could, in a certain sense, trump the Constitution.
One of the few photographs during his presidency, when was this taken?
Oh, this is a photograph. I can't see it. Is this the one that's...
The battlefield.
Oh, it's on the battlefield when he went. Yes, he went a dozen times to visit the soldiers. And what would happen is that after each battle was lost, he felt compelled to go and talk among the soldiers. He would ride his horse in their ranks. He would visit them in the hospital. Somehow it buoyed their spirits, and then it buoyed his in turn to see them. And he would come back then, having their spirit inside of himself. And the amazing thing was these trips, as this one indicates, to the soldiers were so important to the soldiers that when Lincoln ran again in 1864 against General McClellan, who had been so popular with the soldiers earlier in the war, he said that he cared more about the soldiers' vote than he did even about winning the second election. If he could win the soldiers' vote and lose the second election, he'd be fine. If he won the second election and lost the soldiers' vote, he'd be devastated. And the amazing thing was some bond had occurred between all these trips to the front, where the soldiers voted 8 out of 10 for Lincoln, even though they knew that voting for Lincoln meant prolonging the war, since McClellan probably would have brought about some compromise peace, maybe even losing their lives. But they'd come to trust the cause and to trust this man. And that, I think, was one of his greatest gratifications of that second election.
If you've just joined us, our conversation with Doris Kearns Goodwin. Our next call is from Stoneham, Massachusetts.
Hi, Doris.
Hi.
It's a pleasure to talk to you. I've been so excited about hearing your book, and I've just ordered it, and I'm anxious to read it.
Thank you.
First of all, quickly, do you have anything to do with Spielberg's new movie on Lincoln?
Oh, I do indeed.
What is that going to be about, you know?
Well, sure, I'll talk to you about it. I mean, what happened is that I first met Spielberg in 2000 when he was working on a documentary on the millennium, and he put together a bunch of historians, and he found out I was working on Lincoln, and he said he would like someday to make a movie on Lincoln, and had known a lot about Lincoln. I mean, he's thought about Lincoln, I think, a lot of his life. So he early on optioned the rights to my book before I even finished it. And 2 scriptwriters were put to work on it. The first one, John Logan, who became a great friend. He wrote The Aviator and The Gladiator and The Last Samurai. And then he put a second scriptwriter, Paul Webb, who was a British playwright, who actually has become such a good friend that he spent last Thanksgiving and is coming this Thanksgiving with us. So I'm not sure when it will be made, hopefully sometime soon, but I trust that there's no one's hands I would rather have it in than Spielberg's. And Liam Neeson has been chosen to play Abraham Lincoln.
What did Lincoln sound like?
Everybody says that he had a thin, high-pitched voice, which you can't quite imagine from that large character. But his voice, they said, could range very far, because in those days it was outdoor venues, essentially, and somehow it could be heard wherever it was. There's one reporter who heard him give one of his first speeches, the Peoria speech in 1854, and wrote about it later. And he said when he first started out, you're aware of that thin, high-pitched voice. You're aware of how awkward he looks. And yet, once he started speaking, he spoke with such conviction and with such strength inside that suddenly his voice became louder and his whole energy was seen in his face. His face would light up, his body would move, and he became a different person. So there's no question that matching the dazzling words that he was able to write, his voice was able to deliver them with heartfelt feeling, and that's the most important thing about a speaker rather than the tenor of his voice.
And you mentioned the movie that is still in the planning stages. What will it be called?
Oh, I don't know. I suspect Lincoln. I mean, what else would it be than Lincoln? I hope. I don't know. He'll decide that.
Seattle, Washington, you're next.
Yes, this is Jim.
Hi, Jim.
I just wanted to follow up on the corporations enthroned citation earlier in the show and give you what that citation is.
Oh, thank you.
That was in a letter to Colonel William F. Elkins in November 21, 1864. And some of the surrounding context of that letter, if I might read it, is we might congratulate ourselves that this cruel war is nearing its end. It has a cost, a vast amount of treasure and blood, and it's indeed a trying hour for the Republic. But I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. And as a result of the war, corporations have been enthroned, and an area of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until all wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. I feel at this moment more anxiety for the safety of my country than ever before, even in the midst of war. God grant that my suspicions may prove groundless. And then a few years later, in January of 1837, Lincoln said to this in a speech to the Illinois legislature, these capitalists generally act harmoniously and in concert to fleece the people. Now that they have gotten into quarrel with themselves, we are called upon to appropriate the people's money to settle the quarrel. So I just wondered if you might say a few words on, Lincoln's relationship between capitalists and his view of the commonwealth of the people.
Thank you, caller. Thanks for the follow-up.
Well, what he did say at one point was that labor was prior to capital. I mean, his whole theory was that the laboring people built up a work and a business possibly, and then they created a business that hired other laboring people, but without the laboring man, that everything was primary to that and that capital was subservient to that. That's in a famous speech that he made. And so there's no question, I think, that he would have a sense. I mean, he's obviously in the age before the Industrial Revolution, before you've got robber barons, before you've really got full-scale capitalists. They're just beginning to have people go to the cities and go from the farms and begin to build up a certain amount of wealth. So it's interesting to wonder what he would think if he were in a later age and looked back on that desire to see labor prior to capital.
How do you live with Abraham Lincoln for 10 years?
So well. I must say, I could have gone on another 5 years, another 10 years, and not ever lost interest in him. I'd wake up every morning and know, I look now at the place that I worked. I work on this ridiculous chaise lounge in my study upstairs because I need a laptop and I need all my papers around me, so I can't work at a desk somehow. So I'm sitting sort of like I am right now with the thing with the computer on my lap. I look now at that chaise lounge And I feel sad when I go by it because I've lost the focus of what it was like every day to know. Because my husband works as well, as I said, in the home, he would go to his study on one side of the house, I go to mine, and we would read the newspapers in the morning before working, and I'd have to somehow keep up with the current day because I was doing analysis for NBC at night, so I had to at least imagine I knew what was going on, at least a little bit. And then we'd go into our respective studies, and then we'd actually go into town in Concord to have lunch every day, just to be able to get out. And then I'd read more of the newspapers at lunchtime, go back and work in the afternoons, do errands in the afternoon, and then every night we go to the same restaurant in Concord, this place called Serafina's, where there's a group of 20 or 30 of us, all of whom have children who have grown and need to sit around in a pub-like atmosphere at the bar and become part of each other's lives. And there was something so structured about those days, with Lincoln at the core of it, that I miss it even now. You know, even during the time of Monica Lewinsky or the 2000 election or all the troubles that we've been in 9/11, when I was commenting on them on television, I knew I could wake up the next morning with Abraham Lincoln, and it was a great treat.
So when you pick up the Boston Globe, do you go to the front section or the sports page?
I get the sports page first. We have a deal that I get sports first, and my husband has the front page, and then we switch.
We're going to show our audience your home in Concord, Massachusetts. We traveled up there in preparing for this interview, and we will come back and continue our discussion. C-SPAN 2's Book TV In Depth with Doris Kearns Goodwin.
I think my love of history goes back to the days when I was only 6 years old, and my father taught me that mysterious art of how to keep score at baseball games, so I could record for him the history of that afternoon's Brooklyn Dodger game. And somehow when you're only 6 years old and your father comes home and spends 2 hours with you every night listening to you record the history, even if it's just something that happened that afternoon, it makes it seem there's something magic about history. And then I just had a great history teacher in high school that made that a deeper love. And I came to a fascination with the presidency because of having worked with Lyndon Johnson when I was a young girl. So somehow the presidency and the love of history melded together at that point. I like to wake up early in the morning, usually around 6 or 6:30, and go into my study and read over what I had written the day before, hoping that it still looks good. Somehow the night before it always might seem great, and then the next morning, uh-oh, this isn't as good as I thought. And then my husband and I have breakfast, and we both work. He works in another part of the house because he's a writer as well as I am. And then we usually go out for lunch because we're working here all day, break at about 1 o'clock until 2 o'clock, and then do some errands in the afternoon and come back home, maybe work another couple hours. And then there's a restaurant in our town of Concord where about 20 or 30 people gather every night, and we eat around the bar, and it's like a huge family. And then we come home after that. I may do some reading, but not for Lincoln, just reading about some novels or some mysteries, go to bed relatively early so I can get up again at 6 o'clock.
When you are writing a book, do you write as you do your research?
Well, the first couple years really require just the research to get oriented and figure out the angle you're going to take. In my case with Lincoln, just having to read all about the rivals, the team of rivals that I was going to be writing about, meant it was almost like an individual biography on each one of them. So that was just pure research. And that's fun too, because you're just learning the whole time. But then I remember reading an essay by Barbara Tuchman, who was a great historian, saying, don't wait too long to write, because if you wait too long, you might get paralyzed. So as soon as I had a vague sense of where I wanted to go with this book, which took 10 years altogether, probably in year 2 or 1.5, I did start writing, and then would do more research and more writing and more research, and then combine them continually as I went along. This whole shelf over here is all Lincoln books. You know, one of the great things today about being able on the internet to get old books is you really can get a collection of books that may be out of print. So it turns out that there have been more books written about Lincoln than about almost any other public figure. And I was lucky enough by going to used bookstores and internet old book sales to get an entire wall full of Lincoln books and have them right here at my side, which was just terrific. At any one moment I'd say, oh, Seward said that, and be able to go to Seward's diary or go to Chase's diary or go to Stanton's private papers. So everything really was in this room of the books that I needed. And then the rest were papers and primary sources that I dragged into the house in probably, 50 cartons or so that are stacked up in another room.
How do you pick the people you write about?
Well, for me, because it takes me so long to write these books, I have to want to live with the people side by side. Living with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, for example, was such a great pleasure because they were such large characters. And embarrassingly, it took me 6 years to write the book, which meant longer than World War II was fought. So if you're going to spend that much time with them, if you're going to live with them day by day, you better enjoy their company. And so too with Lincoln. I mean, I'd read an essay one time by a great historian, Ida Tarbell, at the turn of the century, last century, and she said the reason so many people write about Lincoln is because he's so companionable. And I truly felt that. I mean, this book took me twice as long as the Civil War took to be fought, and yet I enjoyed every day of living with this man. He was such a great figure, such a good man, and his companionship I really craved day by day. I would have a hard time writing about somebody that I didn't want to live with day by day. I mean, obviously great historians have written about Hitler or Stalin. I don't think it could be me. I need somebody that I respect and admire. Even if they have flaws, I want to enjoy their company day by day.
Doris Kearns Goodwin, the book No Ordinary Time. You begin in Chapter 1 relaying the story of Franklin Roosevelt as president, remembering him as a young boy in Hyde Park and how he would close his eyes and reflect on that time. What was he thinking?
Well, what he was thinking, obviously, was here he was as president, paralyzed from the waist down, unable to walk on his own power ever again since the polio had taken him in his 30s. And he'd been such an athletic, outgoing person before that in terms of his physical activity. So before he'd go to sleep at night, he later said, he liked to remember the days when he was a young boy again at Hyde Park, and there was a big sledding hill behind his house, and he would, as a boy, go to the top of the hill, fly down that hill on his sled, and then take his sled and walk back up to the top. So somehow, instead of counting sheep, he would remember in his mind going up to the top of the sledding hill, going down, going back up again, and that somehow allowed him to calm and go to sleep. But what a sad thing that what gave him that solace was the memory of the time when he, as a young boy, had all of his powers, which were no longer allowed to him.
Who was Missy LeHand?
Missy LeHand was his secretary. She had started working for him when she was about 18 years old, and she in many ways loved him the rest of her life. She became his secretary during the early days. She was with him in the 1920s when he was down in Warm Springs and in Florida trying to get his power to walk again while Eleanor remained at home. And she stayed with him all through the presidency and sadly had a stroke in the middle of his White House years, in the last years during the war, and then went home to Somerville. And that's one of the sad pieces of his life because I felt sad that he didn't keep up with her when she had the stroke. And it was one of those moments when you want to say, Franklin, I love you, you're such a great guy, but you're not being good to this woman. He couldn't bear the hurt of calling her on the phone and knowing that she couldn't talk back to him, but he should have at least talked to her as if she were listening and if she could respond.
One of the, I guess the sense you get from the book No Ordinary Time is that he needed to be around people. That
Absolutely.
the White House on the second floor was a constant buzz of activity and people and cards and social activity, that he was very outgoing.
No question. I mean, I think what happened is in part because he couldn't travel a lot inside Washington. He wanted the people around him at every moment, and he loved to talk, and he loved listening to stories and loved telling stories. So he made that second floor of the White House into almost the most exclusive residential hotel you can possibly imagine. Missy LeHand is living with the family. Churchill comes and spends weeks at a time in a bedroom diagonally across from Roosevelt's. Harry Hopkins, who's his foreign policy advisor, is coming to dinner one night early in the war, sleeps over, never leaves until the war comes to an end. Princess Martha, who is in exile in America during the war, stays up there with the family on the weekends. And Eleanor, of course, is there as well. And Eleanor's great friend, Lorena Hickok, a former reporter who loved Eleanor, is staying next to Eleanor. So I kept imagining what kind of conversations all these people must have had in their bathrobes at night as they gathered in the corridor that surrounds those bedroom suites, and wished that when I'd been up there with Lyndon Johnson, I'd thought of asking, where did Eleanor sleep? Where was Franklin? Where was Churchill? But of course, I wasn't thinking in those terms at 25 years old. So I happened to mention this on a radio program in Washington after my book on Roosevelt's came out. And it happened that Hillary Clinton was listening. So she promptly called me up at the radio station, invited me to sleep overnight in the White House. She said we could then wander the corridor together and figure out where everyone had slept 50 years earlier. So 2 weeks later, she followed up with an invitation to a state dinner between midnight and 2 a.m. after the dinner. My husband and I and Mr. and Mrs. Clinton, with my map in hand, went through every room. Yes, Chelsea is sleeping where Harry Hopkins once was, the Clintons where FDR was, and we were sleeping in Winston Churchill's bedroom. There was no way I could sleep. I was sure he was sitting in the corner drinking his brandy and smoking his ever-present cigar. It was so exciting.
Why did he marry Eleanor?
I think he loved Eleanor when he met her, and there was probably no one like her. I mean, it was to his credit that he could have had any woman at the time. He was very handsome, he was wealthy, he was an aristocrat, and yet he saw in Eleanor something that he hadn't seen in most of the belles that he would have gone to the debutante balls with. She had had such a sad childhood. Her father an alcoholic, her mother dying, her mother so beautiful that she used to make Eleanor feel that Eleanor had failed her mother because she did not have a pretty face. But then Eleanor was sent to a boarding school in England, and the head of the boarding school made her feel that she should have a commitment to social life, not society life, but to social work that was different from most women her age, to not just simply go back and be a debutante. So she started to work in a social house to help people in poverty. And so when he met her, he knew here was a young woman who was interested in politics, in the poor, in the things that he cared about eventually in his life. And I think he chose the best woman for him.
I'm going to read the letter that you found from Lucy Rutherford to Anna Roosevelt. But before I do, describe the relationship between Franklin Roosevelt's daughter and Lucy Rutherford.
Well, what happened, first of all, to get back to who Lucy Rutherford is that when Eleanor and Franklin were married about 12 years or so, she brought in a secretary, Eleanor did, to help her, named Lucy Rutherford, at the time Lucy Mercer, a beautiful young woman, a classy woman actually, and it seemed that Franklin fell for her. At that time, Eleanor was not very confident in her marriage. She had her mother-in-law to contend with, a very powerful figure, Sarah Roosevelt, who had taken control really of the kids and of the family. And she had lost a lot of her zest that she had had when she was a young working girl in this settlement house. And so anyway, Franklin seemed to have fallen for Lucy, and Eleanor eventually discovered some letters that he had written to Lucy and Lucy had written to him, offered him a divorce in 1918, but it was the last thing he wanted. And so obviously they agreed to get together and stay together, and he promised never to see Lucy again. But then what happened, he did keep that promise for a long number of years. But during the White House years, Eleanor traveled. She was the great Eleanor Roosevelt, so she wasn't home a lot, and he got very lonely, especially that last year of his life when his health was failing and he had congestive heart failure. And he happened to run into Lucy again and decided that he wanted to see her again and just have her come and talk to him in the White House. But the only way that he could do that would be to have his daughter Anna, who was working as his hostess in the White House when Eleanor was away, arrange for those meetings. And Anna knew in doing so that it would be hard if her mother ever found out. But on the other hand, she realized that her father needed this companionship. And so she did arrange for Lucy to visit the White House several times in that last year. All might have gone with no one being hurt, but for the unfortunate fact that Lucy happened to be at Warm Springs, Georgia, when he died. So as soon as she left immediately, of course, but as soon as Eleanor came down, she would ask, as you would in a time of death, tell me everything that happened in the last day or so. And they told her that Lucy had been there. And it's hard to imagine how she absorbed that news, even as she had to absorb her husband's death. But luckily in that day and age, there were no press following it up. She didn't have to be humiliated in front of the country. She just had to assume it within herself. And when she found out not only that Lucy had been there, but that her daughter Anna had been the one to make those visits possible, she must have felt she lost her daughter and her husband at the same time. But I was so sad when I heard that and didn't want to end the book that way, and was so delighted to find that eventually she was able to forgive Anna, and the mother and daughter became close once again.
Well, let me read the letter that you include, page 631 of the paperback edition. This is from Lucy Rutherford. Quote, I had not written before for many reasons, but you were constantly in my thoughts and with very loving and heart-torn sympathy, and I was following every step of the way. He told me so often, referring to Franklin Roosevelt, and with such feeling, of all that you had meant of joy and comfort on that trip to Yalta. I love to think of his very great pride in you, Anna. He told me so often and with such feeling of all that you had meant. My love to you, Anna, darling, because you are his child and because you are yourself. I am very devoutly and with heartbroken sympathy, Lucy Rutherford.
Can you imagine what that letter meant to Anna, who was feeling the guiltiness of having arranged for these meetings, knowing that it had hurt her mother, but then knowing that her father, whom she adored, had talked in such loving terms about her to Lucy. And as I say, luckily what happened is that after a while, Eleanor just came to realize how much Franklin had meant to her and to the country, and that their partnership had given her a stage that she never would have had. And everywhere she went after he died, people would tell her how much they loved her husband, conductors, cleaners, people in all walks of life. And I think she was able then to reach back beyond the hurt of knowing that he had seen Lucy in those last years, remember all the good years that they had had together. And for the last years of her life, she just put this out of her mind whenever she talked to Franklin. I'm not sure she put it out of her mind, but she put it out of her public conversation. Whenever she talked of her husband, it was only with love and respect. And it's a wonderful lesson in a way to be able finally to maybe not forget, but to forgive something that had hurt you in the past.
One of the photographs, a very thin and frail Franklin Roosevelt in 1944. Why did he run for a fourth term?
Well, I think he believed still that even though his health was not what it had been before, and I'm not sure he was fully aware of how sick he was such an optimist that even though the doctors told him that he had congestive heart failure, I suspect that part of him thought, I'll beat this thing. I beat polio, so I could beat this. But I think he believed that even without his full health, that since he was in the middle of the war, he had seen it up to that point, he wanted to see it through. My guess is, and sometimes people have talked about the possibility, that had he not died when he did, he still might have turned the presidency over at some point if his health had gotten worse once the war came to an end. But he wanted to see the war that had begun under his term end under his term.
Did he like Harry Truman?
He didn't know Harry Truman very well. I mean, it's one of those weird things that this man who becomes so important in our history, chosen as vice president without a lot of forethought on his mind. And I think it's not to Roosevelt's credit that he didn't spend a lot of time figuring out who his vice president should be or incorporating him into the decision-making process, especially when he was so ill. But I suspect it was part of Roosevelt's denial that he was ill, not to want to think about this guy who's going to replace him. We were just very lucky as a country that Harry Truman was Harry Truman and became such a great president.
Our next call, Highland Beach, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm a great fan of yours.
Thank you.
And I had a question regarding Lincoln in connection to all the presidents you're talking about, and the fact that at some points in the critical times in American history, presidents have made decisions and followed policies that had to be kind of camouflaged in a way in order to be accepted by the people in the Congress. In Lincoln's case, as you said earlier, he was fighting a war to preserve the democratic experiment, but he framed it as a war to preserve the Union, something people could get their minds around. And in Roosevelt's case, the way he packaged Lend-Lease and other policies to help England before he could get the rest of the country to follow him into engaging in the war as he wanted to, long before Pearl Harbor, and right down to what they say today about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and whether that was really just a justification for responding to the 9/11 attack in a dramatic enough way that sent a message to the world saying that, if you hit us as hard and as drastically as we were, there will be just as hard and drastic retaliation, for lack of a better word, although I guess that's what it is. And our presidents justified in kind of covering up might not be the best word, but using causes and ideas that people can relate to get their policies, which they believe in, to be right, underway.
Thank you.
That's a very thoughtful way of putting it. And I guess it depends on what the overall purpose is that their policy is suggesting as to whether or not it really does move with the grain of history, whether it will create greater peace in the world, whether it creates greater justice in the world. You're right in talking about Roosevelt that even in the early days before Pearl Harbor, he would talk about Lend-Lease as a way of preventing us from having to get in the war, that if we could aid Britain, that somehow then Britain would hold out against Germany and it might make it easier for us not to be in the war, even though at some level I suspect he knew that we were going to have to get in that war. Now, could you say that that's deceptive? I think what he understood was that, in fact, way back in 1938, he had given a speech about quarantining the dictators, and it created such an uproar in Congress, calls for his impeachment, that he was going to try and entangle us in what was going on in Europe, that he said it's a terrible thing to be the president in democracy. You feel like you're leading a parade, and you look over your shoulders and nobody's following you. So he realized you had to move step by step to educate and shape public opinion to where you want them to go. And in that case, getting America involved, in my judgment, in World War II was essential. If Hitler had been allowed to succeed in that war, entire Western civilization would have been destroyed. So you do what you can to bring the people along, and the goal was absolutely worth it. He did do a peacetime draft, he did Lend-Lease, he armed the ships, and I think in some ways his greatest leadership was even before Pearl Harbor, because it meant we were more prepared when Pearl Harbor finally happened. And I think similarly with Lincoln, he had to move step by step toward that Emancipation Proclamation. He knew that if he had done it 6 months earlier, he later said, he would have lost the border states. If he had done it later, he would have lost the morale boost that it came. It's one of those mystical things about a leader that they understand where the people are and how to move them step by step. So I think ultimately the question will be, was the war in Iraq truly the right battle in the war on terror, or did it become a diversion from the war on terror? Did it use up our resources and our treasures? Did it use up the lives for a larger purpose? And that's still what history, or did it do what they were hoping eventually, if it turned out to become a strengthening hold in democracy, or as you suggest, to show other people that you better not mess with us or we'll retaliate. And history still is very unclear about which way that's going to turn out. But that will be the judge of whether or not that early talking about it in a different way is justified or not. If the end result is not right, if the war turns out to be a diversion, if it hurt the war on terror effort, then I think that the deception at the beginning will be even more difficult to accept.
We're getting a lot of emails. Let me share a few with you. Neil Schaefer of Milwaukee says, do you think that Lincoln would have been as revered as he is now had he not been assassinated?
Well, there's probably no question that dying at the height of the war just about to be won and not having to deal with Reconstruction and all the messy problems of peace probably did keep his reputation intact in a way that it wouldn't have been had he had to deal with it. Even saying that, however, I would so much rather have had him, and I think the country would have been so much better off dealing with Reconstruction than Andrew Johnson, even if it meant that his reputation was somewhat diminished because it was complicated and messy. To have him with that much greater sense of empathy, I think, toward the South, but at the same time protecting the rights of Black Americans, if we had had a better Reconstruction and what followed it had not been as deadly, maybe the whole country would be better off still today. And then it would be worth it to have some people say, no, he wasn't good with Reconstruction, he was great with war. I'd still have that.
The students from Bishop Kelly High School in Tulsa, Oklahoma, they're all watching. One of the students, Katie Gotwell, says, do you think it was a wise decision for Lincoln to choose a Southern Democrat, Andrew Johnson?
Well, I think at the time he thought it was a wise decision because it meant that he was binding up this party that would come after the war. He needed to have Democrats and Republicans together in a kind of union party. And Andrew Johnson had been a supporter of the war. He had been a good military governor. As it turned out, however, he didn't know enough about Andrew Johnson's character and the weakness and the kind of leader he would become. It became somewhat evident on the inauguration day, that second inaugural, because he had had too much to drink, he hadn't been well, and he gave this incredible rambling speech that everybody was panicked, that would suggest that he was not going to be up to the job. So I think had he known Andrew Johnson better, he might not have been chosen. Actually, the president in those days didn't have as much to say about who the vice president would be. The convention decided that more than he, but I think at the time he was pleased to have that connection with a Southern Democrat as far as his being a Northern Republican. It did not turn out very well.
Another one of those students, Damar Thompson, says, how did women influence Lincoln's presidency?
How did women influence Lincoln's presidency? Well, obviously, in some ways, the sad relationship that developed with his wife influenced the loneliness that he felt during the presidency. When his little 10-year-old son, Willie, died in February of 1862, Mary was forever altered, and she took to her bed and really couldn't even be a mother to their youngest son, Tad, who was 8 at the time. Willie had been almost like the little Lincoln. He could write poetry, he was sensitive, he took care of his younger brother who had a speech defect and most people couldn't understand what he was saying. And when Willie died, these diseases would spread through the capital, typhoid from the bad drinking water because the soldiers were using the river as a latrine. It killed Willie, and in many ways it killed Mary. And so I think it in some ways allowed Lincoln to feel, however, the personal loss of the war and maybe to project that even more to the people at large when he talked about the family circles that were also broken because a soldier was lost. That empathy that was a remarkable part of his own temperament was probably strengthened by this loving kid and having this little kid die in the middle of the war.
Another email from Ken Gleason, who says, I think you're too willing to give credit to your history teachers. I am a college history teacher, and you should give more credit to your enormous energy, intensity, interest, and talent. And says, aren't you the red-haired girl in the spring of 1955 talking to myself and others as we waited to go into the entrance exam at St. Agnes Catholic High School in Rockville Center?
Oh, wow. That is exactly where I went to Catholic school. I mean, I went to public school, actually, but would go to CCD on Wednesdays and Sundays and got my confirmation in 1955. That is true.
When was this picture taken?
Oh, this was at spring training. I would go down to spring training when my boys were little just to be able to write some sort of an article and be able to play around and see the players in such relaxed settings. This is Wade Boggs, and I actually wrote an article on him one year about his quest for the batting title. And it turned out to be an extraordinary story because what happened is I got very close to his sister. He was very close to his mother and his sister and his family, and his sister had multiple sclerosis, and she was a big history buff. So after I'd written the article, she came to Concord, my hometown, to see the historic sites in Concord, and I took her around, and we became friends as a result of it. And then one day in 1986, it would have been, the year that the Red Sox almost won the World Series, she called me one day and we were talking, and I mentioned that Wade Boggs had a broken rib, and we were afraid the doctors, and typical baseball fans, we didn't think the doctor was taking good care of him. I said he's got to get to another doctor. So it turned out that his sister called the mother to say maybe he should go to a different doctor. And sadly what happened is then the mother called Wade Boggs and told her, and he told her that he loved her. She went out minutes later and was killed in a car crash with her mother in turn. So his grandmother and his mother were gone. And for days, he just went home. He was so close to the family, and no one knew when he'd come back to the Red Sox. And in that period of time, I got a call from him. It was just astonishing. He just wanted to thank me that because of my call to the sister, and the sister's call to the mother, and the mother's call to him, he had had a chance to tell her he loved her right before she died. So what started out as just this, frivolous kind of baseball article about Wade Boggs turned out to mean something more to both of us.
And these are the boys?
These are the boys. That's when they were little. Richard on the left, who's now in his 30s, and then Joey is in my lap, and Michael is to the right. They're 27 and 28.
Our next call comes to us from Los Angeles.
Yes. First off, as a comment relative to what the caller from Florida had said and what you'd said about the Iraq War, it does seem that, Zbigniew Brzezinski is not a particularly big fan of democracy, and he's the guy who mapped out this strategy in 1996 with the grand chessboard, I think is what he calls it. And if the people who currently run this country are big little d Democrats, I would be quite surprised. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been trying to overthrow Hugo Chavez for 3 or 4 years, and also having overthrown and having previously destabilized Jean-Bertrand Aristide and re-emplaced the Tonton Macoute or their successors. What I would say relative to Lincoln is that I think these people who are currently running our country are sort of coming out of that imperial presidency, which he was the first to really create through executive order. And while it's a sort of a thing that's clung to by elements of the far right, I think there is some truth to the notion that when the Congress adjourns sine die by Robert's Rules of Order, there's no lawful way that the president can use emergency powers to reconvene it.
Thanks for the call.
No, you are right that what happened is after Fort Sumter, Congress was not set to it was not in process right then. I mean, those days Congress only sat for 3 or 4 months because it was such a long time to get there. So Lincoln did have to take executive actions and hope they would be sustained when the Congress finally came into being in July 4th of 1861. And there is no question that war has continually centralized power in the executive. It happened in the Civil War, it happened in World War I, it happened in World War II, and it's happened in recent years with foreign policy having such a precedence, so that we do have to worry about that. And I think one of the things that so saddens me about the history of the Iraqi war is that the debate that took place in Congress before Congress authorized the president to take the actions that he did with Saddam Hussein was so shortened. I remember Robert Byrd standing up and saying, this is terrible that we are not debating this. The halls of the Congress are silent. And I think the Democrats were to blame as well as the Republicans. It seemed to me, remembering back on that, everybody was worried about the midterm elections. They wanted to get this over. And they were afraid, I think everybody, of not standing up and looking strong after September 11th. But as a result, we went into that authorization to the president without the Congress really fully absorbing what the information is they were getting. If we'd had longer time, if we'd had more intelligence reports, if we had forced the administration to talk more to the Congress, maybe that authorization would not have taken place.
Another email, John Moore of Lake Jackson, Texas. From your personal experiences working closely with Lyndon Johnson, can you comment on Robert Caro's biography volumes on his life and political career?
I think Caro's fantastic. I mean, he is as a good a writer as we'll ever get, I think, in history writing. His ability to render to life, like, for example, in that first volume when he talks about electricity coming to rural Texas, I mean, it's just magical the way he makes it come alive for the people living there. And I think as he keeps going along, he's just understood Lyndon Johnson. Johnson may not have liked some of the things he said about him, but Johnson would be very proud, I think, to know that a man of his stature has spent his life working on him. I always have this fear someday that in the afterlife there'll be a panel of all the presidents that I've ever studied, and each one will be telling me what I got wrong. And the first person will be Lyndon Johnson saying, and how come that damn book on the Kennedys was twice as long as the book you wrote about me? Well, Robert Caro's books are 3 times as long as anything I've written, and they're worth every word.
Jan Hassan, Minnesota, you're next.
Franklin Roosevelt achieved so much, such as Social Security, the SEC, the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee, the Fair Labor Standards Act, FDIC, FHA, unemployment insurance, the GI Bill, temporary relief jobs to get people through the Great Depression. But I've always believed his best work was his extraordinary leadership during World War II. And my question is, how or why was Franklin Roosevelt so effective during World War II, and the country was so unified, especially when you compare that to the quagmire in Vietnam or the current mess in Iraq, where it seems to be going so badly?
Well, you know, I think what Roosevelt understood in World War II was that if it were going to be a long war, which he suspected it was, that you had to involve as many people on the home front as possible so they would feel connected to that war. So in that regard, what he did, first of all, he had 12 or 13 million people working in the factories during the war, and another 14 million were drafted and in the army during the war. But then he also had auxiliary fire, auxiliary police. He had blood drives. He had people buying bonds, even if it wasn't the most efficient way to raise money for the war, because he wanted them to feel part of the drive. He had aluminum drives. He had scrap rubber drives, all of which was designed to say that if we're going to be fighting a war abroad, everybody at home should feel connected to it. I'd often thought that after September 11th that President Bush had this incredible opportunity. If he had gone to the country, and just as Roosevelt did, Roosevelt said when that war happened, Dr. New Deal now has to become Dr. Win the War. And it made some of the liberals mad because he decided he had to have a partnership with business. If they were going to build the tanks and the weapons and the planes that were necessary for the war, he gave them great contracts, he relaxed antitrust regulations. They became important to him, even as he protected labor at the same time. If President Bush had gone to the country and said, you know, Dr. Tax Cut now has to become Mr. 9/11, and use the resources that the tax cut had provided possibly to emergency situation to make it better in our country, it might have been ready there for Katrina. We could have had a public health system that was strengthened for the potential of biological attack that would have been good in its own right, as well as helping in case there were a biological attack. There could have been auxiliary fire, there could have been auxiliary police, there could have been potentially a draft again so that more people were felt to be part of this effort instead of having this small group of people that are in a volunteer army. All of that was possible. There was such unity after 9/11. And then I think what history will have to suggest, Afghanistan seemed to have produced and kept that unity. Was Iraq the right battle to fight to keep that unity alive? So far that unity seems to be breaking apart. And with all that wellspring of support, one might have hoped that our home front could have been mobilized in a somewhat different way.
From No Ordinary Time, can you describe the relationship between Sarah Roosevelt, her son, and Eleanor?
I would not have wanted, I think, Sarah Roosevelt as a mother-in-law if I were Eleanor Roosevelt. She was very important to Franklin, however. She gave him whatever that confidence is that he had as a young boy and then as a president and as an older man came from that mother's undying love. Her only child with her husband, who was a much older man, and she doted on him, but so much so that I think sometimes it was hard for him because when he was young, she took him out of school. She didn't let him go to Groton till he was older than the other people, and he never got along easily with men of his own age. But nonetheless, once he got married, I don't think she was ready to let him go. And as a result of that, Eleanor had a very hard time finding a relationship with her husband. She moved into a house. She created 2 houses in New York, one for her and one for them, you know, with a corridor that went right in between. when Eleanor tried to discipline her children, somehow she would be the one who would say, no, don't worry. If one of her kids did something bad, Eleanor's child, she then bought him a car to make him feel better. So I think that she was a very difficult force in Eleanor's life and made their marriage much more complicated than it would otherwise have been, even though she gave him that fundamental confidence that a mother gives a child.
How long did she live?
She died in the 40s, so she was pretty old. She was a sturdy character, and her death, I think it was in 41, was very hard for him. He wore a black armband for a long period of time. I mean, he really did love that woman, so I've got to give her enormous credit for that.
Santa Rosa, California, for Doris Kearns Goodwin. You're next.
Yeah, this is a rumor that I've heard. By the way, great show. Thank you very much. About Lincoln, and I don't know if it's true. Maybe you found something that might indicate such, that he might have been bisexual or gay. And also, did Eleanor have a lesbian relationship?
Thank you.
Oh, actually, those two questions do belong together in a certain way, because here's what I came away thinking. As far as Lincoln goes, people assumed he might have been gay, and they've written about it recently for two reasons. One, that he slept in the same bed with his great friend Joshua Speed for 3 years, and two, that he wrote flowery letters to Speed, which ended with "Yours forever, Lincoln." But in fact, as I looked into that period of time, what I discovered is that men's relationship with each other were very intense there, more than it would be now, and women's likely were intense with one another. And sleeping in the same bed was not anything unusual. When Lincoln was on the circuit in Illinois, he actually would sleep sometimes 2 or 3 to a bed. The only person who got his own bed was the judge, because he weighed 300 pounds, so he had his own bed. And then I discovered the letters between the other people that I was writing about. For example, when Seward and Chase were young men, they had both lost their wives. This is before, of course, they became Secretary of War and Secretary of Treasury. And here's what Stanton writes to, not Seward and Chase, Chase and Stanton, rather. Stanton writes to Chase, and he says, ever since our intercourse last summer, no one is in my mind more waking and sleeping. I dream of you at night, and I want to hold you by the hand and say I love you. No one suggested that Stanton was gay. No one suggested that Chase was gay. When Seward was in the state legislature, an older state senator became romantically involved with him. They became romantic, I think, without sex, saying, ever since I think about you, I feel womanish in my feelings about you. No one suggested that either one of them were gay. And in fact, this older colleague of Seward's eventually tried to make a pass at Seward's wife, and it almost broke up Seward's marriage. So I think if we look back in the time, we have to realize that men had these close attachments. There was no definition then of what homosexuality meant until, I think, 1868. But more importantly, they felt free to talk to one another in this flowery way that might seem odd to today's modern world. Similarly, Eleanor wrote very flowery letters to her friend Lorena Hickok, and women historians have written about the 19th century and the early 20th century to say that was very common for women to write that way to each other. And I think part of it is that women and men couldn't have friendships the same way they can today. Everything was so structured and chaperoned. So men and women became more intensely involved. And I would argue that it's probably the context of the time that is more important than to label them today from our own perspective.
The question has been answered by Thomas Lee on the Wigwam in Chicago.
Oh, yay! I can't believe I forgot it already.
That's okay. He said it was along the Chicago River at the intersection of Lake and Wacker. It was built in 1860 and torn down or destroyed in 1867.
Well, thank him very much. That's great. This was good about this show.
Atlanta is next.
Hello. I have 2 quick questions, and then I'll hang up. Number 1, what was the deal with General McClellan? For the Supreme Union Commander, he certainly seemed very helpful to the South. And then, of course, he ran against Lincoln in 1864. Was he a high-level saboteur? And number 2, how concerned was Lincoln about the gathering strength of the old colonial powers? There were English troops in Canada, French troops in Mexico. Was he concerned that the old colonial powers wanted to try to move back in, carve up the North American continent as they had in the previous centuries?
Thank you.
Well, on your second question first, yes, he was very concerned. In fact, England and France, I think, viewed the Civil War as an opportunity for them not only to come back and get more land, perhaps, from America, but even more importantly, they wanted the whole democratic experiment to fail. I mean, they're protecting monarchies. They're protecting a different form of government. So if it proved that ordinary people could not govern themselves, it was good for them. And especially the aristocrats, especially the wealthy classes in England and France, were the ones who in many ways were supporting the South in their struggle against the North. So it was very important. And Seward, as his Secretary of State, played yeoman work, actually, in keeping the English people out of the war and keeping the French out of the war. The masses in England, the working men, were very in favor of the Northern cause because they were in favor of emancipation. But the ruling powers were exactly as you suggested, trying to maneuver us into a situation where if the North were to lose and if the South split off, then maybe they could pick off Mexico, things could be done. So as far as your first question goes, which I now forgot. What was the first question? Are you still there?
He is not, actually.
Okay, well, I'll come back to it when I remember. I shouldn't have answered the first one.
That's okay, but I was looking at this email. This is from Ray Anderson of West Virginia, saying that if Lincoln were to be involved in politics today, which party would he align himself with?
Well, the interesting thing is, if Lincoln were involved today, he was very loyal politically. It took him a long time to leave the Whigs before he became a Republican. So I think he would stay with the Republican Party, but my guess is he would try to move it in a progressive fashion so that it did care about people who didn't have educational opportunity, it did care about people who were poor, and was able, he once said that government was there to do for individuals what they could not do so well for themselves. And so I think he'd have a different philosophy from the conservative elements of the Republican Party, but I think he'd probably try and make the Republican Party what he believed in rather than to switch to some other party.
And the caller was asking about General McClellan. Why did he
run against
Lincoln in 1864?
Well, to go back to the caller's argument about what was General McClellan and was he a saboteur, now I remember the question. I mean, I don't think it's fair to say McClellan was a saboteur. What happened is that he was a conservative Democrat. He did not believe that emancipation should be at all a goal in the war. And as a result, he was very upset when Lincoln introduced the Emancipation Proclamation. He thought it would make the war longer, it would give more resistance to the South. But more importantly, the trouble with him as a general, which Lincoln should have seen earlier than he did, was that he was great at organizing the troops. The troops loved him, he could discipline them, and we had no army to begin with, so he needed to do that. But he created a great engine, as Lincoln finally later said, but it was a stationary engine. He somehow didn't have whatever it took to take his troops into war. Some people have argued that he loved them so much he didn't want to take them into battle. Some people have argued that he really was going slow because he wanted the war to come to an end without hurting the South. But whatever it was, he turned out not to be a very good general, no question, and Lincoln took too long to actually ask for his resignation. So then in 1864, in the summer of 1864, it looked like the fortunes of the war were at a very low ebb. Even though Gettysburg had been won and Vicksburg had been won for the North, Lincoln wasn't sure that he was going to win another election because the morale was down, the war was going on too long, so many lives had been lost. People were blaming him that the Emancipation Proclamation had prolonged the war. So the Democratic Convention thought McClellan would be the perfect person to run against him because he had the support in the North of what were called the conservative Democrats, the Copperheads, the people who thought the war was going on too long and a compromise peace would be a good thing to happen. And I think he thought, because he'd been so popular with the Army, that he would have the support of this huge element that was in the Army. As it turned out, Lincoln won that Army vote, which mattered so much to him. And McClellan handled the election terribly. His letters to the people and the papers were troubled, and he then went off into the sunset and made money. But the trouble with McClellan was that he wrote letters to his wife all during the Civil War. And the letters are so damning to him that now that they've been published, I think that's hurt his whole reputation forever for history. He talks when he first gets in there that God has placed him where he is, that he could be a dictator if he wanted to, and he says such terrible things about Lincoln and Stanton. He never takes responsibility for any of his failures. During the Peninsula Campaign, when he failed, he blamed it outright on Stanton to the extent what Stanton, in fact, he wrote a telegram in to the White House saying, if I lose this battle, it will be your fault, and you have sacrificed the Army. And in fact, the telegraph operator was so stunned at the insubordination of that last line that he cut it out so that Lincoln and Stanton didn't see that. It became knowledgeable later. But Lincoln then, after Stanton was getting hounded by the newspapers, after McClellan was going everywhere saying the reason he lost the Peninsula Campaign was that Stanton had refused to reinforce him when he had soldiers that he could have sent to him, Lincoln then gave a huge speech to a Union rally, bigger than any rally since the inauguration, in which he took the responsibility. He said, it's not Stanton. I had no soldiers to send him. I would have sent them if I could, and you're not to blame Stanton, and it finally stopped the critique of Stanton. But just the opposite of Lincoln, who acknowledged errors immediately, who shouldered responsibility for the failures of his subordinates, McClellan was just the opposite, always blaming somebody else for what he did.
Once a month, we spend 3 hours with a distinguished author, and this month, Doris Kearns Goodwin is our guest. Another 45 minutes with more of your phone calls. Paris, California.
Good morning. My name is Shira. I'm calling from Paris, California. Mrs. Kearns, you have such a wonderful compassion for writing history. any time in the future, do you plan on writing a book about civil rights?
You know, I don't know what I'm going to do next, and that is a good idea. You know, one of the difficulties is that you get so caught up in what you're doing that it's hard to imagine leaving Lincoln right now. But in some ways, civil rights movement would be the logical outgrowth of the fact that after Lincoln left the presidency, it still needed that civil rights movement in the 1950s, 1960s to complete the emancipation and the true beginning of the breakdown of segregation and true beginning of equality for Black Americans. So it might be a nice sequel. The hard thing is, as I say, even when I had to move from Roosevelt to Lincoln, and I had to move all my Roosevelt books out of my study, I felt like somehow I was betraying Roosevelt. And so I think it'll be a while before I can leave Mr. Lincoln behind. But at some point soon, I'm sure I'll come up with something else, because I can't wait to be back in the thick of another book again.
Next call, Little Rock, Arkansas. Go ahead, please. Caller, you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. Goodwin. I wanted to ask you to please opine on the modern-day phenom that high-tech computerization has eliminated the need of big government socialism that the Democrats offer. And what could they possibly bring to the table to assist our free enterprise capitalist system?
Well, you know, I think what the Democrats still stand for is the idea that government can aid people in areas where they cannot aid themselves, which is what Lincoln stood for so many years ago. And there's no question in my mind still that Social Security is a fundamental right that the Democrats are arguing to protect, that there is a need, obviously, for free enterprise. If it's truly free to be there, our system is built upon that. But in some cases, that free enterprise doesn't really become free, and you've got corporations that need to have some sort of stimulus from the government to make sure that they're not undoing that freedom that we stand for. And there's no question that there's issues of health care, and there's issues of job creation, and issues of poverty that I think the Democrats traditionally have talked about. Now, whether or not they've been able to reach the country today to argue that those are the right values that we should be fighting for as a country is the question, because they haven't won in recent elections. But the values that underwrote the Democratic Party, in my argument, in my mind, in the 60s, when the civil rights movement was there, when Medicare was first formed, when aid to education came through in order to use the government to help people who might not have had the chance to help themselves, when Social Security was updated, and when the civil rights laws were passed to end segregation and to bring voting rights to Black Americans. I think all of those are things that our country is eventually proud of, and that was originally initiated under Democratic authority, even though Republicans, and great Republicans, came by their side. And I look back, you know, some people look on the 60s as a sad period because it ended so badly with the anti-Vietnam War movement and the deaths of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King. But in some ways, it was a time when people cared about public issues, and they were willing to fight for those public issues. And I look back on that era with some nostalgia, I must say. Maybe it's because I was younger then, though. That's probably part of it.
What did President Johnson feel? How did he feel about Martin Luther King?
Well, I think at the beginning there was some sense of tension because Martin Luther King's a leader. Any president feels here's a leader and he's operating outside the system of the government and was pressing the government to move more quickly than Johnson might have thought he was able to move. But the amazing thing that happened, I think, was that after the Civil Rights Act of '64 passed, ending segregation in the South, and Martin Luther King was obviously instrumental in creating the movement that created the impetus to create that act, Johnson got such enormous pleasure from knowing he had done something that would stand the test of time that he became a real civil rights advocate. And in 1965, after the first act had passed, his advisor said, don't go for voting rights. The country has to absorb that Civil Rights Act of '64. But he said, this is my moment. It may not continue. I'm going for it. So in his State of the Union address in '65, he called for a Voting Rights Act. And then, of course, Martin Luther King made that come alive by his march from Selma to Alabama in Montgomery. And when he was beaten up by the Southern people down there and the police force, it made the country feel a certain sense of wanting to do something to make this right. And that's when Lyndon Johnson called for a joint session of Congress and gave the great speech called the We Shall Overcome speech. In fact, I'm proud to say my husband worked on that speech, and I was a graduate student at the time, and I remember being with my friends feeling it was one of the great moments in history to hear Lyndon Johnson, because what happened then was that he, in the middle of the speech, he talked about civil rights is not a black problem, it's not a white problem. History and fate have come together in one place in Selma, Alabama, just as they did in Lexington and Concord, just as they did in Appomattox. And then he took up the anthem of the civil rights movement and said, and we shall overcome. And for all of us who'd been involved in the civil rights movement, that was the anthem. So to hear the president no longer fighting against the civil rights movement, but actually embracing it at that moment, it was a moment worthy, most emotional moment of my young life, I think, as in public life.
How did you meet your husband?
Well, he came to Harvard while I was teaching there to finish a book, and he had an office right near mine, and I, of course, knew he was, and he claims he sort of knew about me because he knew I had worked for Lyndon Johnson, and he asked me out to dinner. And I must say, the first night I met him, I knew that this was the man I wanted to marry, but it took a while.
Our next call comes to us from Oakland, California. Go ahead, please. Oakland, you with us?
I grew up in Brooklyn and went to St. Paul's Catholic Church, school rather. The nuns also loved the Brooklyn Dodgers.
No kidding.
We would all have to pray for them to win the series.
That's great.
I have two questions. In 2001, President Bush signed an executive order permanently sealing off from the public all presidential records, going back to Reagan. Now, any request for documents relating to past presidencies have to be approved by the White House. Will this affect the work of historians like yourself? And secondly, President Lincoln was a brilliant president. I believe he wrote most of his own speeches. But did Lincoln depend on any one advisor to the degree that President Bush depends on Karl Rove?
Well, you know, I think as far as your first question goes, that in recent years, probably in the last 40 years even, there's been a tendency to hold back presidential papers more and more, and it just seems to be escalating with each year. I remember even when we were working on Johnson's memoirs, a lot of what was going to be used in the memoirs was not going to be open later for the people until years went by. Even the tapes, it's taken a while for them to be transcribed and put into the public use. So it is true, I think, that historians are going to be proscribed in what they do by this tendency of presidents to be closing off records. I mean, eventually they'll be opened up, but by that time, the immediacy of the event and the understanding of the context might be lessened. So it probably will make it harder, I think, for historians to get that full job. And I think that, I don't know, I mean, I think in some ways, you know, even more problematic for people will be that idea that letters, as we talked about earlier, are not being written. Diaries are not being kept in the middle of the White House because people are afraid they might be subpoenaed at a certain point. So you're not going to have that intimate record that people had in later times.
Sam and Lori Smith of Longwood, Florida, email, did you have any ongoing interactions with the First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson, and what kind of relationship did you have in putting the book together?
Well, I got to know her in those last years when I was going down to the ranch, because I actually stayed at the ranch. And I must say that she is one of the classiest women I've ever known. She loved that man. She protected him. She went about her own work. She was working on her own memoir at that time. And she welcomed, I'd like to believe, my coming down there to be with him because it was almost like I could be a camp counselor. Lyndon Johnson needed somebody at his side every moment. So when I was there, I'd like to believe she felt she was free to go shopping or go into Austin or do something because I could keep him company. But without her, I think, the stability that she provided, I don't think he ever would have become what he did. She was so different from him, so empathetic, so compassionate in a human being. When he would yell at somebody, she would never do that. She could ease things over for that person that he might have hurt, and he loved her. There's no question about that.
Did you ever get the Johnson treatment?
Not really. I mean, interestingly, I think maybe because I saw him do that to other people, and it's one thing it's not easily able to forgive. I don't think you can ever yell at somebody in public in any good way and humiliate them. What I used to hear he did when he did this in the White House, he'd feel so bad the next day that maybe a car would arrive at that person's home as a makeup because I didn't mean to yell at you. But he never really, he would tease me. You know, he would call me a lefty and he would call me a pinko, and he would think that I was part of that younger generation that didn't understand why the war in Vietnam had to be fought, but never with a mean-spiritedness. And I suspect it was because it was later in his life. Had I known him at the height of his power, I'm sure he never would have talked to me as openly as he did, or never would have spent so much time with me. Obviously, he wouldn't have had time, but in those last years he was lonely, and I happened to be there.
Levittown, Rhode Island, you're next.
Ms. Goodwin, I'd like to ask you a question, and then I'd like to respond to your answer. During the 30s, the Liberty League, which was the leaders of the capitalist world in this country, tried to finance a overthrow of the Roosevelt administration, tried to convince General Smedley Butler to become a dictator in this country. These same pro-fascists were financing the Hitler war machine in Germany for the purpose of defeating the communists, and the communists eventually saved capitalism from the fascists that they created. I'd like your point of view on this, and I'd also like to respond to your answer.
Thank you, caller.
Sure. I mean, you are right that things were so confused at that time. We now look on communism as a negative force in the world, but there's no question but that in World War II, without Russia, without the communists' ability to join in the Allied cause after Hitler had tried to defeat Russia and then Russia came back on our side, that things would have been very different, and I think fascism would have had a much greater chance of existing. And there were fights in Europe between communists and fascists. There were fights here between communists and fascists, and I think the world was in so much better off, at least when fascism was destroyed. And then if only communism had stuck to some of that earlier ideology that was part of Marx, which had to do with labor and its priorities to capital, just as Lincoln had talked about much earlier, and not gotten into the loss of civil liberties and the kind of top-heavy government it did, there was something ideologically that they were right about at the beginning, but it went all awry, I think, with Stalin.
Caller, we want to move on to other calls, but a quick follow-up.
What I like to say is the fact that the Russians saved us from the fascists that we created. We created Hitler and Mussolini. DuPont had controlling interest of General Motors and was building tanks and armored cars in Nazi Germany during the 30s.
Thanks for the call. San Diego, you're next.
Yes, hi. Thank you, C-SPAN, for putting this on. I really appreciate this opportunity. I think I spent more time trying to get through to you guys than I have trying to get through to a rock concert in my youth.
Wow!
To get tickets. Miss Goodwin, thank you for taking my call. I've been working on a documentary about an event that occurred in Los Angeles, specifically June 23rd, 1967. President Johnson had come to Los Angeles to kick off his Democratic fundraiser for his re-election campaign. And I've been working on this for about 4 years, so you're really an inspiration to me in the way that you stick with a story for so long and you really imbibe the person. My question to you is, do you have any event? This was known as the Century Plaza protest, also known by some as Bloody Friday. I happened to be a 10-month-old baby at this event, and there was a picture published of me in the Free Press of what seemed to be police batons coming over my baby carriage and my mom fending them off. I know specifically through some White House documents that one of these were sent off to the White House because the president's statement was that he didn't see the civil unrest occurring outside the Century Plaza Hotel. So I was wondering if you have any personal knowledge of this event and or what's your opinion on the effect of the anti-war movement demonstrations and Johnson's decision not to run again in March of '68.
Thank you, caller.
Yeah, I don't know specifically about that event, but there's no question that you're right, that those anti-war demonstrations were increasing in '67 and '68. And I think Johnson felt unable to go around the country in any free way, and he was really limited to a certain extent to going to Army camps when he gave speeches and not being able to be as free as he was before then. And I'm sure that that contributed to his feeling that if he were going to run again in '68 and go around the country campaigning, it would be a very difficult. It was so hard for him to see those signs, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? The movement had grown in intensity, and he knew that he had lost a large part of the American people, and that's partly what I think made him withdraw from that race. I mean, it's always said that when Walter Cronkite turned against the war, as he seemed to, saying it was a stalemate after the Tet Offensive, that Johnson said he had lost Middle America. But even before that, in '67, as you suggest, and earlier in '68, he had seen those massive demonstrations, and he must have known that it would impede any chance he had to go around the country. He had so loved the campaign in '64. His energy was just phenomenal. He would stay up until 3 a.m., even if there were just 3 people left in a crowd, and he couldn't get that energy back from the crowd because he wasn't going to be able to go around the country again. So I think the anti-war movement and its strength, not only because it produced McCarthy and it produced the primary and it produced Bobby Kennedy, and he didn't want to run against Bobby Kennedy, the very fact that those demonstrations were taking place, hampering him, had something to do with his withdrawing from the race. So it was important.
Frank Longo of Northbrook, Illinois says that a recent segment on Meet the Press left the distinct impression that Lyndon Johnson named Ramsey Clark as Attorney General specifically to get his father, Tom Clark, to resign his position on the Supreme Court in order to nominate Thurgood Marshall.
That was an amazing tape. When I heard that on Meet the Press, I hadn't known that tape before, but what you hear is Lyndon Johnson talking to Tom Clark and to Ramsey Clark. And he wants to put Ramsey Clark on the court, but most importantly, he wants to get Tom Clark off, and wants to put Ramsey Clark in as into the cabinet, but he most importantly wants to get Tom Clark off there so he can point the first black American to the court. So he's saying to Tom, he's saying to Ramsey, I'd like to get you into this attorney general's job, but it can't really quite happen if your father's on the court because it'll be some sort of a conflict of interest. And Ramsey says, well, I'm not so sure it's a conflict of interest. And John says, oh, I think it is. And the next thing you know, of course, Ramsey talks to his father, Tom Clark. Tom Clark decides that he's going to retire from the court, even though he wasn't that old, to give his son a chance. So it was one of those ways that Lyndon is playing three different people for a goal that's a good goal, to put Marshall on the court.
You were quoted as saying, in reference to LBJ, that I think some people who go into public life, if they go in needing the applause of thousands, they're never going to work out successfully in the end because they don't know who they are apart from the crowds.
Yeah, it did seem that Johnson had this enormous hole inside that needed to be filled by the applause of the people. And in a system like ours, where everybody goes up and down in reputation, even the best presidents go through really tough eras, if that's what's holding you up, it's going to not sustain you. That's why there was the difference between Lincoln and my argument, who wanted the office and the power for accomplishing something that would stand the test of time. So if the people turned against him or he failed in a certain sense, he could be driven by that larger goal. Now, Johnson eventually, when he became president, did have larger goals in mind, and I think he became a stronger person. But up until that time, he seemed to be the kind of person who just needed to have that support from the people to fill up some need inside that wasn't quite there.
Springfield, Illinois. Go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. How are you able, in writing your book on Lincoln, to stay on your topic when there are so many other interesting little tidbits that you didn't find yourself going off on tangents? And then, are you going to be coming in and doing a book signing here?
I am. I'm coming, I think, February 12th to Springfield to speak at the library. I can't wait to see the new library. I was there at the groundbreaking with David Donald, and so I saw it in its very early stages, but I can't wait to see the finished product. It sounds amazing. It is true, you do get off on tangents, and you get involved with everybody's life, and you just have to make sure that you don't let the narrative be destroyed as a result. For example, Seward had a daughter named Fanny, and when she was 16, she wanted to be a writer, so she started to keep a diary. And her diary is wonderful. I mean, it's a young girl's diary. She keeps it until she's 21 years old, and then she dies at 21. She didn't even think she wanted to get married because she thought you couldn't have a career as a writer and be married. So all of her life force is poured into this diary. So I became so interested in this little girl, Fanny. I became so interested in her mother, Frances. And they're important to my story, but not as important as I almost was going to make them. I mean, I would sometimes go half a chapter on one or the other, and then you finally have to decide you have to cut back. Similarly, Kate Chase, Chase's daughter, and she was such an interesting, sad creature who was the most beautiful woman of her age, everybody courting her, and she marries this wealthy man just in order to help her father's ambitions. And I found the love letters between her and her husband, and he turned out to be an alcoholic and to abuse her, and I found those letters as well of hers later in life. And all of that was past the part of my book, so it's like one paragraph in the epilogue. But you do keep involving yourself in all the people, and the key as a narrative historian, you have to decide when to introduce them and when to cut them out and just say, some other day I might write about these people, or I can talk about them to my friends, but if I put their full stories in here, the book will not only be 700 pages of text, it'll be 12,000, and no one will be able to pick it up.
Jack Whidden had emailed, and there's a photograph of the scene in your book. He said that I heard a number of accounts on what Secretary Stanton said when Lincoln passed away. One said, now he belongs to the angels. 24 hours, it was reported that he said, now he belongs to the ages.
Yes, that is true. I mean, there are about 4 or 5 different accounts. Some say he now belongs to the ages, now he belongs to the ages. And it's one of those moments, just as that picture that you're showing, where a lot of people were there that night. After he was assassinated, they carried him to this Peterson house across the street, and the members of his cabinet came, some of his friends came, his secretaries came. But at the end, more people claimed they were there than actually were there. It's one of those moments where everybody wants to be at a big event, and they were teasing that the room could not possibly have kept all those people together. So you can quite imagine that whatever was said that night gets reported in a newspaper, and then it goes down through the ages, and no one's exactly clear. But the words that we now remember as Stanton's words are, now he belongs belongs to the ages, which is a wonderful tribute, especially given Lincoln's desire to be remembered after he died.
For Doris Kearns Goodwin, Tucson, Arizona. Next caller. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Ruth, calling from Tucson, and my first introduction to you was through the Ken Burns baseball series, and which made me a great fan of you. Anyway, I was just wondering, what was your impression of that project and of working with Mr. Burns?
Oh, Burns is such a passionate, enthusiastic character that he makes all of the things he do comes alive, I think. What happened is he came to see me because he knew that he was going to be making the Brooklyn Dodgers and the Red Sox big parts of his series on baseball, given such underdogs they were and so much passion and so much drama around them. And he knew that I had been both fans of the Brooklyn Dodgers originally and then the Red Sox. But I had no idea when he came. We talked for maybe like an hour and a half, and you think you're going to be on there for like a half a minute or 2 minutes. So I told him everything about old boyfriends that I had liked who I gave up because they didn't like baseball, even mentioning one of these boyfriends. And somehow all these things were put on the air, but it was a wonderful experience. In fact, the interesting thing is my book on Roosevelt came out the same year that his documentary on baseball came out. And so everywhere I went to talk about Roosevelt, people would ask me about baseball because they'd seen his documentary. And it was really that response of people, a lot of women coming up to me and say, we had a similar relationship with our father. We loved baseball as well. He taught me how to keep score. And people would talk about their memories of growing up in the 50s in a similar town to the one that I'd grown up in. And that's really what prompted me. I never would have written a memoir. The idea of writing a memoir seemed ridiculous for me because I wasn't a big public figure. But I decided to write about growing up in love with the Dodgers because of Ken Burns' documentary. And it gave me so much more pleasure than I could possibly have imagined to recreate that time in my life. And the weird thing is, I think anyone that grew up in the 50s in a suburb, there was something almost universal about our lives. You know, jumping rope, being out on the street, you know, having a bicycle where you could have a kickstand and you didn't have to have a lock on it, loving baseball as passionately as we did, the McCarthy era and what that meant, and the early civil rights era, that it turned out that the memoir struck a chord, I think, not because it was my story, but because it turned out to be a lot of other stories as well, and that all is owed to Ken Burns. I never would have done it without him.
By the way, who was the Ebbets in Ebbetsfield?
Some guy named Charlie Ebbets. So he's gone down in history forever, even though Ebbetsfield is finally gone. But I think the park was built way back in like 1912. So it was one of the smallest and most intimate and most wonderful parks that ever existed.
New York City, you're next.
My question is for Mrs. Goodwin about the contrast between Lincoln, who had very little formal education, certainly no wealth or privilege in his background, who wrote incredibly beautiful speeches and letters, many of which have been quoted this afternoon, and the current chief executive, who comes from a background of wealth and privilege, private school, Yale University, who seems unable even to write a simple sentence. This seems to be a trend in politics today. We don't have any great speakers or writers. I'm just curious about that. Thank you.
Well, you know, one of the things that so struck me about Lincoln's early education compared to educational system today is that he didn't have a width of education, but he was so deep in the things that he read. I mean, for example, as a young child, he had to scour the countryside for books and everything he could lay his hands on, he would read, but they were some of the best literature in our history. He read Shakespeare, he read Aesop's Fables, he read the King James Bible, he read poetry. And so these cadences, I think, got into his soul and his heart and allowed him to become, he obviously had extraordinary talent to become that great writer. And in some ways, I think literature allowed him to transcend his surroundings, because Emily Dickinson once said, there is no frigate like a book to take us lands away. And through literature, he was able to go with Shakespeare's kings to England, though he never went there in his life. He was able to go to Spain and Portugal with Lord Byron. And that love of books was so much a part of him that because it was self-taught, I think it got into his soul in a way. I compare that with the education today. It's so broad. You know, our students take so many different courses and fragments of one course and another, and maybe they don't get as deep a feeling for the literature of a few great things as they might, and certainly as Lincoln did in the old days. Plus the fact that, I mean, he just wrote and edited and wrote. It was part of a muscle in him that from the time he was a child developed more and more. And I think what happens today is there's so many speechwriters on that White House staff, not just with Bush, but previously. And so they're not doing it themselves in the same way, so they're not getting better because it isn't part of their importance. But it is important because communicating to the country and being able to give them a sense of where you're taking them still remains a central tool for a president. And television can't take away from the words. The words have to be there, the words to persuade. I mean, Roosevelt would spend, when he went on his fireside chats, I'd always thought he was on the radio every week like our current presidents are. Turned out he only gave about 33 fireside chats in his 12 years as president, only 2 or 3 a year, because he said he worked on them so hard it would take a whole week out of his presidency to make sure the words were right. So that's what I think we need in our modern day, not just for our presidents, but for our young people.
The morning of February 22nd, 1958, it was a Saturday morning. You received a phone call early in the day. You get off the phone, and your father says, "My pal is gone."
Right.
My pal is gone. What happened?
Well, my mother had had this rheumatic fever as a child and a weakened heart, had had several heart attacks when I was growing up, but somehow I still never thought that she would die, and she had died in her sleep that night. And, you know, when you're a child, I mean, you're 15 years old, I think the hardest thing is just that you can't imagine right away that it's happened. So my sister was there, I had this wonderful middle sister who actually came and stayed home with our family. She was a nurse in New York at the time, so that she could help take care of me, and in many ways became a second mother to me. But in a certain sense, I think when you're that age, you don't even appreciate the loss as fully as I did later. When I had my own children, I knew that my children would never know my mother. I'd never be able to share my mother with them. They'd never know their grandmother, as they never knew my father either. The older you get, the more you realize how devastating it is to lose a parent at that age. You're so wrapped up at that time in your life that somehow you think life, you just force yourself to have life go on, and you're back in high school, you're back with your friends. And it's later, I think, more that I realized what a vacuum it created in my life.
But on a lighter note, you talk about how your sister was embarrassed when your mom was pregnant with you.
Oh, yes. Well, you see, I was a late child in the family. One sister was 15 and one was 10 when I was born. And so they must have thought, what are these old parents doing having this other kid come along? So thank God my mother did get pregnant. I was glad for that, needless to say.
Orem, Utah, you're next.
Yes. My first question is, why do you believe there was such animosity between Lyndon Johnson and Robert Kennedy? Was it political differences or personalities, personal problems? And the second, have you considered, I loved your book, Fitzgerald's and Kennedy's, have you considered writing a book about President Kennedy? Thank you.
Well, I think the animosity between Lyndon Johnson and Bobby Kennedy was partly personal and partly political. Somehow those two men just hated each other. And I think that was visceral. You know, you just come up against somebody and you can't stand them. And I think it was then exacerbated by the fact that when Johnson was made vice president, he had been such a powerful majority leader, and he felt as vice president that he was left out of the loop on all sorts of decisions that Kennedy was making. And he somehow didn't want to blame Kennedy. He liked Kennedy. In fact, the two of them, Jack Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, got along fairly well. Kennedy liked listening to Johnson's stories. He knew what a character and a rogue Johnson was. But then when he wasn't getting invited to meetings or in decisions, he always blamed Bobby. He thought Bobby was keeping him out of the meetings. And then when Lyndon Johnson becomes president, after John Kennedy has died, I think Bobby felt that somehow Johnson was upstaging his brother, that he had become such an important president, the civil rights things had happened under his watch, and that therefore somehow his brother's echo in history would be lessened. And then, of course, when Bobby runs for the Senate and then is potentially going to run for the presidency against Lyndon Johnson, it only makes it worse. So there was absolutely no love left between those two people. I don't know, you know, it's true. My book on the Fitzgeralds and Kennedys ended with President Kennedy becoming president, and it didn't go any further. But there have been so many wonderful books written about his presidency that I'd have to be able to figure out, again, a different way into it if I were going to follow up with that.
Palm Bay, Florida, you're next.
It's a great honor, Ms. Goodwin. I have three very quick questions. Can you name a current senator that resembles a true Democrat from the 60s? And also, was President Lincoln, is it true that he was the father of the modern-day income tax, and it was mostly for defense of our country and not really social programs? And the last one is, do you think Lincoln and Martin Luther King would be proud of Black Americans since the civil rights movement ended with the law and everything? Because it seems to me like they're really squandering what they're still fighting for civil rights instead of taking the opportunities that have been given to them. Thank you.
Well, you know, I think the hardest thing for civil rights leaders now is that after The fight for segregation was one, and after the Voting Rights Act was put into place, to argue about education and poverty, it's so much more scattered. It's much harder to have a focus for it. And I think that's part of the reason why we haven't seen the same kind of dramatic, sterling leadership that we had in the 1960s. But I suspect that the times have just made that much harder. We haven't seen great leaders anywhere, I think, for the last few years, so it's probably not fair to blame the black leaders any more than leaders in general. You know, when I think about looking about who embodies the values, Democrats or Republicans, the most important thing that I think Lincoln had was this extraordinary empathy that was able to see both sides of an issue. He gave a great speech when he was a young man to a temperance society in which he argued you're never going to change people who are drinking or the dram sellers who sell the drink by denouncing them, by using anathema. Anathema breeds anathema, denunciation breeds denunciation. And he called for trying to understand. He said the best way into a person's heart is to understand them and not to simply shun them. Men will retreat within themselves. So I think what we need is not somebody who's simply an activist Democrat or an activist Republican, but somebody who can understand where both sides are coming from. And the problem now is that our system makes that so much less likely. The primaries reward people with the most extreme positions on either side. Television loves people who are counterpoint, who can really say, you know, exactly what they feel, and then the other person on the other side. I mean, I look at people like John McCain, and I think he's one of the people who's trying to understand where the Democrats are, even though he's a Republican. We need Democrats who can understand where the Republicans are, because we're never going to get anywhere with this kind of denunciation breeds denunciation, which is where our politics is at today. Lincoln would be very sad about that, I think.
Good afternoon to Salem, Oregon. You're next.
Yes. Doris, I had the great pleasure of listening to you speak at Willamette University.
Oh, I remember being there.
It was a wonderful experience. My question is about Mary Lincoln and how she was treated by those colleagues and supporters of Lincoln after he was assassinated. And also, if you came across in your research any information about an Abram Wakeman, who's an ancestor of mine, who reportedly was a close friend of Mary Lincoln. Thank you very much.
Yes, definitely there is an Abram Wakeman, and he was a New Yorker, and he supported Mary a little bit after he died, after Lincoln died, helping her. She was always worried about whether she had enough money to exist, and she wrote lots of friendly letters to Abram Wakeman. You should look for them in the Lincoln collection, or in the Mary collection, because I think you'll find your ancestor an interesting character. The sad thing, I think, for Mary was that even once she became First Lady, there was no place for her to find a footing. The Southerners distrusted her, of course, because she was married to Abraham Lincoln. The Northerners distrusted her because she had 4 Confederate brothers, stepbrothers in the Confederate Army. Westerners, and Easterners rather, thought that she was kind of crude because she was a Westerner. So she tried to redecorate the White House and make it a symbol of the Union as the one contribution to his presidency. But at the time when the soldiers didn't have enough money for blankets, as Lincoln later said, it seemed like the wrong thing to be spending money on these flub-dubs, as he put it, in the White House. So her reputation during his presidency was really hurt a lot. And when he died, there wasn't this same wellspring of support to help her. I mean, it seemed unfair in a way. I mean, they gave Grant a house. You know, they were providing pensions for other people, and they didn't, for a long period, they finally had to fight to give Mary any kind of a pension. And I think it was in part because she had had such bad press during his presidency. And then she felt that they owed it to her afterwards. And also, though it's last year, she was so worried about money and unwisely spending it. She may have had some manic depressiveness. There's one point at which she bought 300 pair of gloves that her son, fearing that he needed to protect her, put her into an asylum. She actually was able to get out pretty soon, proving that she was not mentally ill, but then went to live in Springfield and had a very sad ending to what should have been a much happier life.
There was a ball that took place shortly before Willie passed away. Why did the Lincolns host this ball, and why was that significant in your book?
Well, what happened is Mary was trying to figure out a new social function that would be dramatic for the White House. Most of the White House receptions were open to anybody, so they would be rather crude affairs if these backwoodsmen are coming in with a diplomat side by side. So she decided to have an invitation-only ball, and the invitation became the hottest card in Washington, and it was a very exciting event. She planned it for weeks and weeks. Right before the event, her sons, both of them, Willie and Tad, got very sick, and she thought actually she should cancel the ball. But Lincoln decided that the doctor had said they were recovering, it would be all right, that the ball could still be held. So they held it. But during that night of the ball, which should have been her triumph, in fact, everybody said it was a great innovation, this ball, she kept going upstairs to see Willie and Tad. And then when Willie died, not long thereafter, she felt in a certain sense that it was her pride and her desire to do these things in the White House that somehow had offended God and ended up with Willie dying. So that ball was always a terrible memory, even though it was her moment of triumph as a First Lady.
Boston is next. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Doris. I'm very glad to hear you. You're a wonderful speaker. And I would like to ask you two questions. Have you ever thought of recording some of the interesting stories of history? And because you're so adept at describing them. And the second question I have is, do you think the war in Iraq is actually a skirmish in a larger conflict between Islam and Christianity, which might eventually end in a war?
Well, you know, as far as recording the stories, there is a wonderful thing, I think, about oral history. You know, whether I'm a part of it or not, it's a great thing, I think, to allow people's voices, and they now are doing it more and more with living politicians and living people. I mean, even during World War II, for example, oral histories were done of women who went to work in the factories, and the stories they told are just, you could never get them later, and they're in their own voices, and then those oral histories get transcribed. So I think the general idea of transcribing stories is critical for history. I remember hearing those factory workers talk. The women would say when they came home when their husbands came home after World War II and they suddenly saw their wives who'd been working independently in factories writing a check. What are you doing? You've never written a check before. You know, or they said they somehow felt like they had become oak trees when they were gone and their husbands couldn't deal with it when they got home. Or the funny stories, so many of the stories that make up the sort of the best part of history occur between people saying them. So I'm very much in favor of oral histories, whether I do it or not. And I think there's no question but that as far as your second idea goes, that we are in something large right now between not just our country, but between democracy and Islam. And we've got to just hope that it doesn't become a larger war, because there's nothing more frightening, I think, as there have been in history, when a war becomes a religious war and there's some overtones of that where there's no sense of any compromise possible, we could be in for a very long and very bad time. So we've just got to hope that it doesn't escalate into something like that. There are elements of it already, but hopefully we can avoid that.
Our last question comes from your first book, and it's a viewer who was on the C-SPAN Book TV bus recently from Forreston, Illinois.
Hi, my name is Eric Welch. I live in Forreston, Illinois. First of all, I want to say I'm a huge fan of Brian Lamb and C-SPAN and Book TV in particular. Secondly, thanks for the opportunity to ask this question of Doris Kearns Goodwin. I wonder, in the research you've done on the many presidents that you've examined, whether you've been able to identify any fatal flaw in any of their presidencies. I'm particularly interested in that of Lyndon Johnson. I really enjoyed your book, Lyndon Johnson and the American Dream.
I think the fatal flaw, and it probably is not just confined to Lyndon Johnson, when things get tough for a president, what seems to happen is they hunker down with the people who support their point of view. When the Vietnam War began to be difficult, when the country stopped supporting it as fully as they had, rather than reaching out for opponents and rather than reaching out for those congressmen and senators who might have given him a different perspective on what to do in the war, there was that natural tendency to surround himself with the people who agreed with him. And that only means that you fool yourself even deeper into a hole. And I think it probably has relevance for us today, you know, that when things are difficult, the time is then there to reach out to people who disagree with you, who can debate with you, who can argue with you, so that you can see other points of view and maybe get out of the hole that one is in.
What surprised you the most in putting together a team of rivals?
Well, you know, I think the most superficial thing that surprised me, but it probably isn't superficial, is that having seen the sad eyes that Lincoln had, having known about his melancholy temperament, I had no idea how dynamic a personality he had. I mean, I'm sure the Lincoln scholars who've studied them their whole life understood that, but for me, he ended up being much more vital, much more alive. I've even teased that he seemed even sexy in one of the pictures. There's this great picture of him before that terrible beard that he grew to please this little girl. And there was a sense in which he's got a rugged face. I think it's on page 200. He's got a rugged face. There's disheveled hair. Maybe I like disheveled hair because my husband has disheveled hair and big hair like Lincoln's. But you look at that, and that's not the image we have when we think of him in the Marble Monument. And then as I read further and I realized that he was the one sustaining everyone else's spirits, that he could start a cabinet meeting with a funny story, that he could relax people by telling a joke. and that these jokes were so funny and amusing, and they had something to do with what was going on. There was a live force in him that I hadn't suspected. I knew I respected him, I knew I admired him, but I didn't realize I'd feel such affection for him.
Published by Simon & Schuster, Doris Kearns Goodwin, the latest Team of Rivals, The Political Genius of Abraham Lincoln. By the way, a complete list of all of her works available at booktv.org. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, what great fun. Thank you.
Please come back again.
I'd love to.